I arrived at my inherited lakeside cabin in northern Minnesota for a long-awaited weekend retreat, only to find the locks changed, my sister Madison's belongings scattered throughout every room, and a handwritten sign on the kitchen counter reading, "Property of Madison Walsh. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The family heirloom grandfather clock was missing from the mantel. My grandmother's antique quilts had been replaced with Madison's modern throws. Most devastating of all, I discovered legal documents on the coffee table suggesting Madison had filed adverse possession claims on the property. My hands trembled as I dialed Madison's number, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in the empty cabin that no longer felt like mine. The phone rang 3 times before her familiar voice answered, but there was something cold and calculated in her tone that I'd never heard before. "Madison, what the hell is going on at the cabin?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "I can't get in with my key, and there are legal papers everywhere talking about adverse possession. This is insane." "Oh, Darby," she replied with a sickeningly sweet laugh that made my skin crawl. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up. Mom and Dad told me you never use the place anyway, so we all agreed it should come to me instead. It makes perfect sense when you think about it logically." "What do you mean you all agreed?" I shouted, no longer caring about maintaining composure. "This isn't a family democracy. Grandmother Evelyn left the cabin to me in her will, not to the entire family to vote on like some kind of reality show elimination." Madison's voice turned ice cold, and I could practically hear her shrug through the phone. "Well, things change, dear sister. I have 3 children who need a stable place for summer vacations, and you're just a single teacher living in that tiny Minneapolis apartment. The cabin serves a real family purpose now, instead of sitting empty 11 months of the year while you pretend to care about grandmother's memory." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Madison knew perfectly well that I visited the cabin regularly throughout the year, not just during summer months. I'd spent countless weekends there, grading papers, reading by the fireplace, and maintaining the property, just as grandmother Evelyn had taught me. The suggestion that I neglected our grandmother's legacy was both cruel and completely false. "I'm driving to Mom and Dad's house right now," I said through gritted teeth. "This conversation isn't over, and neither is my legal ownership of that property. You can't just steal someone's inheritance because you think you deserve it more." "Good luck with that," Madison replied cheerfully before hanging up, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. The drive to Duluth felt endless, my mind racing with questions and growing dread about what I might discover. How long had this conspiracy been brewing behind my back? What lies had Madison told our parents to convince them to betray their own daughter's legal inheritance? Most importantly, how could my own family have orchestrated such an elaborate deception without giving me any warning or opportunity to defend myself? When I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, I noticed Madison's silver minivan parked beside Dad's pickup truck. My stomach dropped as I realized she'd probably been expecting my call and had rushed over to control the narrative before I could present my side of the story. The front door opened before I could knock, revealing my mother, Helen's anxious face framed by her newly styled gray hair. Darby, sweetheart, come in and sit down," she said, her voice carrying that overly gentle tone she used when delivering bad news. "We need to have a family discussion about the cabin situation." I followed her into the living room where Madison sat smugly on the couch next to our father, Robert, who couldn't meet my eyes. The coffee table was covered with official-looking documents, and I noticed Madison had positioned herself strategically between me and the papers as if guarding state secrets. "Mom, Dad, I need you to explain why Madison thinks she can steal my inheritance," I said, choosing to stand rather than sit in what felt increasingly like an ambush. "The cabin belongs to me legally, morally, and according to grandmother Evelyn's explicit wishes. This isn't open for family debate or democratic voting." Robert finally looked up, his weathered face showing a mixture of guilt and stubborn defensiveness. Now, Darby, that's not exactly how we see the situation here. Your grandmother made that will years ago when circumstances were different. Madison has real practical needs for the cabin while you've barely used it since college. That's a complete lie and you know it. I shot back, feeling my composure cracking. I've been there almost every month for the past 3 years. I've paid for maintenance repairs and property taxes without asking anyone for help. I've honored grandmother's memory by preserving everything exactly as she left it. Madison leaned forward with a condescending smile that made me want to scream. Darby, you're being incredibly selfish about this whole thing. My children need stability and family traditions, especially after their father and I divorced. The cabin could provide them with the same magical summers we had growing up, instead of sitting empty while you pursue your little teaching career in the city. Helen nodded enthusiastically, clearly having been thoroughly convinced by Madison's version of events. That's exactly what we've been thinking, honey. Madison's been through such a difficult time with the divorce, and those precious grandchildren deserve to have the cabin as their special place. You're young and successful with your whole life ahead of you. Surely you can understand putting family needs first. I stared at my parents in complete shock, realizing that Madison had masterfully manipulated them, using their love for their grandchildren as emotional leverage. She'd painted herself as the struggling single mother who needed family support, while portraying me as the selfish career woman who'd abandoned family obligations for personal ambition. "Have you all lost your minds?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't about who needs the cabin more or who has children. This is about respecting legal inheritance and honoring a dead woman's final wishes. Grandmother Evelyn specifically chose me as the cabin's guardian, and she had good reasons for that decision. Madison stood up abruptly, her mask of sweetness finally slipping to reveal the calculating opportunist underneath. Your precious grandmother is dead, Darby. The living family members get to make practical decisions about what's best for everyone involved. I've already changed the locks, moved my belongings in, and filed the necessary paperwork to establish legal residence. The cabin is mine now, whether you like it or not. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock that had belonged to my great-grandfather. I looked at each family member in turn, searching for any sign of the people who had raised me with values of honesty, fairness, and respect for others. Instead, I saw strangers who had chosen sides in a battle I didn't even know was being fought. I can't believe you've all been plotting against me for months," I said, backing toward the door. "Grandmother Evelyn would be heartbroken to know that her own family destroyed itself over money and property. She trusted me with the cabin because she knew I would protect its legacy and meaning not turn it into some prize to be stolen and redistributed." As I reached for the door handle, Helen called out desperately, "Darby, wait. We've been telling everyone in the family that you decided to give the cabin to Madison voluntarily. It would be so much easier if we could just make this official and avoid any unpleasant legal complications." I turned back one final time, looking at the 3 people who had just revealed themselves to be capable of breathtaking betrayal and manipulation. Madison's triumphant smirk told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly she had orchestrated this family coup. "The only thing that's going to be official is my legal response to this theft," I said firmly. "Madison, you picked the wrong person to try and swindle. I'm going to fight for what's rightfully mine, and I'm going to win." The law office of Sarah Jenkins occupied the 2nd floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Duluth. Its burgundy carpet and mahogany furniture designed to convey competence and tradition. I sat across from Sarah's imposing desk, watching her review the inheritance documents I'd brought while trying to process the devastating conversation with my family from the night before. Sarah was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses that she peered over with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. Her reputation as the area's most experienced estate attorney had cost me a 2-week waiting period for this appointment, but I needed expert guidance before Madison's scheme progressed any further. "Well, Miss Walsh," Sarah said, finally removing her glasses and setting the papers aside, "you definitely have clear legal ownership of the property based on your grandmother's will and the probate court's final decree. However, your sister's adverse possession filing creates some concerning complications that we need to address immediately." My stomach tightened as I leaned forward in the leather chair. What kind of complications? She's been living there for maybe 3 months at most. Surely that's not long enough to establish any legitimate claim to someone else's property. Sarah's expression grew more serious as she pulled out a thick legal reference book and flipped to a marked section. Under Minnesota law, adverse possession requires 7 years of continuous exclusive occupancy of the property. If your sister can maintain exclusive control of the cabin for that duration while you're unable to exercise your ownership rights, she could potentially acquire legal title regardless of the original inheritance. The words hit me like ice water. 7 years of being locked out of my own property while Madison established herself as the rightful owner through nothing more than stubborn persistence and family manipulation. The injustice of it made my hands clench into fists. "But that's insane," I protested. "She's essentially stealing my inheritance in broad daylight, and the law protects her right to do it as long as she can maintain the theft for 7 years. What kind of legal system allows that to happen?" "The doctrine exists to prevent abandoned property from remaining unused indefinitely," Sarah explained patiently. "In theory, it serves a legitimate social purpose. In practice, it can be abused by opportunistic family members who exploit emotional manipulation and legal technicalities, which appears to be exactly what's happening in your case." She opened a manila folder and pulled out a yellow legal pad covered with handwritten notes and calculations. "Now, let's discuss the practical realities of contesting this claim. Filing the necessary motions to remove your sister from the property and establishing a clear court order protecting your ownership rights will require extensive litigation." I nodded eagerly, ready to authorize whatever legal action was necessary to reclaim my inheritance. Whatever it costs, I'm prepared to fight this. Madison can't be allowed to steal family property through lies and manipulation. Sarah's next words shattered my confidence completely. The retainer alone will be $15,000 with additional hourly fees likely to bring the total cost to at least $25,000 before we reach any final resolution. Family property disputes are particularly expensive because they tend to become emotionally charged battles of attrition rather than straightforward legal proceedings. I felt the blood drain from my face as the financial reality crashed over me. My savings account contained exactly $3,200 after paying for my car repairs the previous month. My teaching salary of $38,000 annually barely covered my Minneapolis apartment rent, student loan payments, and basic living expenses, leaving virtually nothing for major, unexpected legal costs. "I don't have that kind of money," I admitted, quietly embarrassed by my financial limitations. "Is there any way to handle this with a smaller upfront investment? Maybe payment plans or contingency arrangements?" Sarah shook her head sympathetically but firmly. Property disputes require substantial upfront investment because they involve complex title research, expert witnesses, and potentially lengthy court proceedings. Your sister appears to have significant financial resources from her divorce settlement, which means she can afford to drag this case out for years if necessary. My heart sank as I realized that Madison had probably calculated this exact scenario. She knew my financial situation intimately from years of family conversations about my student loans and teaching budget constraints. Her divorce settlement had reportedly been substantial, giving her the resources to outspend me in any legal battle while I struggled to afford basic representation. "There's another complication I need to mention," Sarah continued, consulting her notes again. Your sister has apparently been quite strategic in her choice of local legal counsel. She's already consulted with 3 other attorneys in this area, ostensibly seeking advice about her rights. I looked at her in confusion. What does that have to do with my case? Those consultations create conflicts of interest that prevent me from representing you if I've had any previous contact with those firms or their clients, Sarah explained. It's a common tactic in small legal communities to limit an opponent's access to experienced local counsel. You may need to look for representation in Minneapolis or St. Paul, which will increase both costs and complexity significantly. The manipulative brilliance of Madison's strategy was becoming clearer by the minute. She hadn't just stolen my property and turned my family against me. She'd systematically undermined my ability to mount an effective legal response by creating conflicts of interest and financial barriers that would intimidate most people into submission. So you're telling me that my sister can steal my inheritance and the legal system essentially protects her right to do it as long as she has more money than I do? I asked, my voice rising with frustration and despair. Sarah closed the legal reference book and leaned back in her chair, her expression mixing professional sympathy with practical realism. I'm telling you that property law heavily favors the party with superior financial resources and strategic planning. Your sister appears to have both advantages in this situation. She paused for a moment, then continued more gently. There is one alternative approach you might consider. Rather than engaging in expensive litigation, you could explore negotiating a buyout arrangement where your sister compensates you for your ownership interest. It's not ideal, but it might be more financially practical than trying to outspend her in court. The suggestion felt like surrender, like admitting that Madison's theft was acceptable as long as she paid me some compensation for the privilege of stealing my inheritance. The cabin represented far more than its monetary value. It was the physical embodiment of my relationship with grandmother Evelyn and the peaceful sanctuary that had sustained me through every difficult period of my adult life. I need some time to think about this, I said, gathering my documents and standing to leave. Thank you for your honesty about the challenges I'm facing, even though it's not what I wanted to hear. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown local number. The message was brief but chilling. Darby, this is Madison. I hope your lawyer explained the reality of your situation. I'm prepared to offer you $20,000 for a quick, quiet resolution. Otherwise, I'll see you in court in 7 years when the property becomes mine anyway. Your choice. I stared at the message in disbelief, realizing that Madison had probably been monitoring my activities and knew exactly where I'd spent my afternoon. Her confidence was both infuriating and terrifying, suggesting that she'd planned every aspect of this theft, down to the smallest detail, and was prepared for any response I might attempt. The $20,000 offer was insulting considering the cabin's actual market value of at least $150,000, but it also revealed Madison's awareness that I couldn't afford to fight her in court. She was essentially offering me a small fraction of my own property's worth as compensation for allowing her to steal it without legal complications. As I drove back toward Minneapolis, my mind raced through increasingly desperate alternatives. Could I somehow raise the money for legal fees? Were there any family members who might support my position against Madison's manipulation? Was there any evidence of her deception that could strengthen my case or reduce the cost of litigation? The most painful realization was that my own parents had not only failed to support me, but had actively conspired against their daughter's legal inheritance. Their willingness to believe Madison's lies and participate in her scheme represented a betrayal that cut deeper than the property theft itself. I pulled over at a roadside rest stop and called my best friend from college, hoping that talking through the situation might help me see options I'd missed. Jessica, I need someone to tell me I'm not losing my mind, I said when she answered. My entire family has decided to steal my inheritance, and I can't afford to stop them. The next morning, I drove back to the cabin neighborhood, determined to gather information from sources who might provide a more objective perspective on Madison's behavior and claims. The Peterson house sat on a large corner lot adjacent to the cabin property, its well-maintained garden and American flag, suggesting the kind of observant neighbors who notice everything that happens in their quiet community. Frank Peterson answered the door wearing paint-stained overalls and a genuinely welcoming smile that immediately put me at ease. He was a man in his 70s with calloused hands and the kind of steady gaze that suggested decades of honest work and straightforward communication. "You must be Evelyn's other granddaughter," he said warmly. "Madison mentioned you might be stopping by sometime. Come in, come in. Dorothy's just finished making a fresh pot of coffee, and we'd love to hear how you're doing." His friendly assumption that Madison had prepared them for my visit was the first red flag, but I followed him into their cozy kitchen where Dorothy Peterson was arranging homemade cookies on a ceramic plate. She was a small woman with silver hair and bright blue eyes that radiated the kind of maternal warmth that made you want to confide your troubles immediately. "Oh, how wonderful to finally meet you, dear," Dorothy said, wiping her hands on a floral apron before pulling out a chair for me at their kitchen table. "Madison has told us so much about you over the past few months. We were so sorry to hear about your decision to give up the cabin, but we certainly understand how difficult it must be to maintain a property from so far away." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips as I processed her words. Madison had been spreading the story that I'd voluntarily given up the cabin, presenting herself as the grateful recipient of my generous sacrifice, rather than the calculating thief I knew her to be. "I'm sorry," I said carefully, "but I think there might be some confusion about the situation. I didn't give up the cabin voluntarily. It was left to me in my grandmother's will, and I've been fighting to maintain my ownership rights against Madison's attempt to take it from me." Frank and Dorothy exchanged bewildered glances, their expressions shifting from friendly welcome to concerned confusion. Dorothy set down her own coffee cup with a slight tremor in her hand. "But Madison explained that you decided the cabin was too much responsibility for someone with your busy teaching career in the city," Dorothy said slowly. "She showed us a sympathy card you'd sent, expressing how grateful you were that she could take over the burden of property maintenance and family obligations." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Madison hadn't just lied about my intentions, she'd apparently forged correspondence to support her false narrative. The depth of her deception was staggering, involving fabricated evidence and systematic manipulation of everyone in the community who might have questioned her story. "Dorothy, I never sent any such card," I said firmly but gently, not wanting to upset these kind people who had clearly been manipulated as thoroughly as my parents. "Madison has been lying to everyone about this situation. She changed the locks on my property without permission and has been spreading false stories to justify what is essentially theft." Frank leaned back in his chair, his weathered face showing the kind of skepticism that came from decades of experience with human nature. "That would be a pretty elaborate deception to maintain, young lady. Madison has been nothing but helpful and considerate since she moved in. She's always asking our advice about property maintenance and showing genuine appreciation for the neighborhood's traditions. She's also been hosting those loud parties every weekend," Dorothy added, her tone shifting to mild complaint. "Not that we want to be unfriendly neighbors, but the noise and music until late at night isn't quite what we're used to around here. Your grandmother always kept things peaceful and respectful." This was the opening I needed to expose the contrast between Madison's public persona and her actual behavior. If she was presenting herself as a respectful neighbor while simultaneously disrupting the community's peace, it revealed the same pattern of deception she'd used with our family. What kind of parties?" I asked, pulling out my phone to take notes. "How many people at what time do they usually end, that sort of thing?" Frank consulted a small notebook he pulled from his shirt pocket, apparently the kind of methodical person who documented everything. Last weekend, there were about 20 cars parked along the road music until well past midnight on both Friday and Saturday nights. The weekend before that was similar, maybe 15 cars and loud voices until around 1 in the morning. Dorothy nodded vigorously, clearly having been bothered by the disruption more than she'd initially admitted. And her children have been quite destructive in our garden area. They've been climbing over our fence and trampling through the flower beds, and when Frank mentioned it to Madison, she just laughed and said, "Kids will be kids." She hasn't offered to repair any of the damage or replace the plants they've destroyed. The picture of Madison's true character was becoming clearer with each detail. She was presenting herself as a grateful, responsible family member while actually behaving like an entitled party host who showed no respect for longtime neighbors or community standards. "I hate to ask this," I said hesitantly, "but would you be willing to document these incidents in writing, the noise complaints, the property damage, and the dates when they occurred? It would help establish that Madison's occupancy isn't the peaceful family use she's claimed it to be." Dorothy and Frank looked at each other for a long moment, clearly wrestling with their reluctance to get involved in family disputes versus their growing realization that they'd been deceived about the true situation. "We've lived next to that cabin for 40 years, Dorothy said finally. "Your grandmother was one of the finest people we've ever known, and she spoke about you constantly. She was so proud of your teaching career and the way you'd maintained your connection to this place despite living in the city." Frank nodded in agreement. "Evelyn always said you were the one grandchild who truly understood what the cabin meant to her. She used to worry about what would happen to the property after she was gone, but she felt confident that you would preserve its character and traditions." The validation of my grandmother's confidence in me was both comforting and heartbreaking. These neighbors had witnessed the genuine relationship between Evelyn and me, making Madison's lies about my abandonment of family responsibilities even more obviously false. "Would you mind if I asked what Madison told you about my grandmother's funeral?" I said, testing the extent of her deception. "I'm curious what version of events she shared with you." Dorothy's expression grew troubled as she recalled the conversation. "She said you'd been too busy with work commitments to help with the funeral arrangements, and that you'd barely spoken to anyone at the service. She made it sound like you were anxious to get back to your life in Minneapolis and weren't really grieving appropriately." The distortion of my actual behavior was breathtaking in its cruelty. I'd spent 2 weeks helping coordinate Grandmother Evelyn's funeral, delivering one of the eulogies and staying afterward to help clean out her house and organize her belongings. Madison had somehow twisted my efficiency and emotional composure during a difficult time into evidence of callous indifference. "The truth is that I gave the main eulogy at my grandmother's funeral," I said quietly. "I spent days writing it because I wanted to honor her memory properly. Madison was the one who seemed eager to leave early, and she spent most of the reception discussing the will and property distribution with relatives." Frank closed his notebook and looked at me with the kind of direct assessment that suggested he was rapidly reevaluating everything Madison had told them over the past several months. Young lady, would you mind if Dorothy and I called you in a few days?" he asked. "We'd like some time to think about what you've told us today and maybe pay more attention to what's actually happening over at the cabin. If Madison has been lying about the fundamental facts of this situation, then we've been unknowingly supporting something that goes against everything your grandmother stood for." As I prepared to leave, Dorothy walked me to the door and placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Your grandmother used to say that family loyalty should never require accepting dishonesty or cruelty. She believed that real love sometimes meant standing up to people you care about when they're making destructive choices." The wisdom in those words gave me strength as I drove away from the Peterson house, realizing that I wasn't alone in recognizing Madison's true character. The neighbors who had known our family for decades could see through her deception once presented with the actual facts, which gave me hope that others might be willing to support the truth over Madison's carefully constructed lies. My phone rang as I pulled into a gas station on the way back to Minneapolis. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and I hesitated before answering, unsure whether I was ready for another confrontation. "Darby, honey, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Helen said, her voice carrying a tone of uncertainty I'd never heard before. "Some of the things Madison told us don't quite match up with what I remember about your relationship with your grandmother. Would you be willing to meet with just me without Madison or your father so we can talk more calmly?" The crack in Madison's carefully constructed narrative was finally beginning to show, and I felt the first glimmer of hope since discovering her theft of my inheritance. That evening, I sat at my small kitchen table in my Minneapolis apartment, surrounded by boxes of my grandmother's papers that I'd been slowly organizing since her death 6 months earlier. Most of the documents were routine financial records and personal correspondence, but I'd been putting off the emotional task of reading through her final letters and personal effects. As I carefully opened each envelope and folder, I found myself thinking about Dorothy Peterson's words regarding Grandmother Evelyn's views on family loyalty and honesty. My grandmother had always been a woman of strong principles who believed that love without boundaries was just enabling destructive behavior in disguise. Near the bottom of one box, I discovered a manila envelope with my name, written in Grandmother Evelyn's distinctive handwriting, marked with the date just 3 weeks before her death. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the sealed flap, revealing several pages of her personal stationery covered with the careful script I'd loved since childhood. "My dearest Darby," the letter began, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've inherited the cabin as I intended. I suspect there may be some family members who question this decision, so I wanted to explain my reasoning while my mind is still clear and my intentions cannot be misunderstood." The letter continued with devastating insight into family dynamics that I'd never fully understood. Madison has always viewed the cabin as a potential source of financial gain, rather than a family legacy to be preserved. During my last few visits, she made several comments about updating the property with modern amenities and questioned why I maintained such old-fashioned decorating choices. She suggested that the cabin would be more valuable if it were renovated to appeal to vacation rental markets. I paused in my reading, shocked by this revelation about Madison's true attitude toward our family's history. She'd always presented herself as deeply sentimental about childhood memories and family traditions, but apparently had been calculating the property's commercial potential even while Grandmother Evelyn was still alive. "You, my dear granddaughter, are the only family member who has consistently shown genuine appreciation for the cabin's heritage and natural beauty." The letter continued. "You understand that some things are more valuable than their monetary worth, and that preserving family legacy requires sacrifice and commitment. I've watched you choose to spend quiet weekends at the cabin instead of pursuing more exciting social opportunities. And I know you share my love of the peaceful solitude that makes this place so special." Grandmother Evelyn's words brought tears to my eyes as I remembered countless hours we'd spent together on the cabin's front porch, watching wildlife and discussing everything from literature to life philosophy. Those conversations had shaped my values and worldview in ways I was only beginning to understand. The next section of the letter contained information that made my heart race with excitement and possibility. I've hidden several valuable items throughout the cabin that I never mentioned to other family members. These were intended as your inheritance within an inheritance, a way to help you maintain the property and fight any challenges that might arise to your ownership. She provided detailed descriptions of hiding places I'd never known existed, despite years of familiarity with every room and corner of the cabin. Behind a loose board in the pantry wall, she'd concealed a collection of antique jewelry that had belonged to her mother and grandmother. In a hollowed-out space beneath the basement stairs, valuable first-edition books were wrapped in waterproof containers. Most significantly, she described a small fireproof safe hidden behind a false wall panel in the basement, disguised to look like part of the stone foundation. The combination is your birth month and day, followed by the year I bought the cabin. 071919703, she wrote. Inside, you'll find $25,000 in cash that I saved specifically to help you with legal expenses or property maintenance costs that might arise after my death. I read that paragraph 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. $25,000 would be enough to hire Sarah Jenkins or another qualified attorney and mount a serious legal challenge to Madison's theft. Grandmother Evelyn had essentially provided me with the resources to defend my inheritance from exactly the kind of family manipulation that was now occurring. The letter's final section contained a warning that proved my grandmother's remarkable insight into family dynamics and human nature. I suspect Madison may attempt to challenge my will or manipulate other family members into supporting her claim to the cabin. She has always been skilled at presenting herself as a victim when she doesn't get what she wants, and she knows how to use emotional manipulation to convince others that her desires are actually moral imperatives. The accuracy of this prediction was both comforting and eerie. Grandmother Evelyn had foreseen Madison's tactics months before implementing them and had taken steps to protect my inheritance from exactly the kind of family conspiracy I was now facing. Remember, dear Darby, that standing up for what's right sometimes requires standing alone temporarily, she wrote in closing. Family relationships built on lies and manipulation are not worth preserving at the expense of your integrity and principles. I trust you to protect the cabin's legacy because I know you have the strength and wisdom to fight for what matters, even when the fight is difficult and lonely. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after finishing the letter, feeling my grandmother's presence and guidance in a way that brought both comfort and determination. She'd known this battle was coming and had armed me with both the financial resources and emotional foundation necessary to win. The hidden $25,000 would level the playing field with Madison's divorce settlement money and enable me to afford competent legal representation. More importantly, the letter provided documentary evidence of Grandmother Evelyn's true intentions and her specific concerns about Madison's character and motivations. I carefully photographed each page of the letter with my phone, then placed the original in a safety deposit box at my bank. This evidence would be crucial in court, especially the sections describing Madison's materialistic attitude and comments about commercial development of the cabin property. The next challenge would be retrieving the hidden money and valuables without Madison discovering my activities. According to her text message, she was confident enough in her position to offer me a buyout, which suggested she wasn't expecting any serious legal opposition. That overconfidence might provide the opportunity I needed to access the basement safe and gather the resources necessary to fight back effectively. I spent the rest of the evening researching attorneys in Minneapolis and St. Paul who specialized in property disputes and inheritance law. With adequate funding, I could hire a lawyer who wasn't constrained by the conflicts of interest Madison had created in the local Duluth legal community. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with another text message from Madison. "I hope you're considering my generous offer, Darby. The longer you wait, the stronger my adverse possession claim becomes. Don't let pride cost you the chance to walk away with something instead of nothing." The condescending tone and implicit threat only strengthened my resolve to fight for my inheritance using every resource Grandmother Evelyn had provided. Madison's confidence in her theft would be her downfall because she'd underestimated both my determination and my grandmother's strategic planning. I fell asleep that night, feeling genuinely hopeful for the first time since discovering the changed locks at the cabin. The battle was far from over, but I finally had the weapons necessary to fight back against Madison's elaborate deception and family manipulation. Tomorrow, I would begin the dangerous task of retrieving my hidden inheritance while Madison was away from the cabin, armed with my grandmother's detailed map and the knowledge that I was fighting not just for property, but for justice, truth, and the preservation of everything Grandmother Evelyn had valued most. 3 days later, I sat in my car at the end of the gravel road leading to the cabin, watching through binoculars as Madison loaded her 3 children into her silver minivan for their weekly swimming lessons at the community center in town. According to the schedule I'd observed over the past few days, she would be gone for exactly 2 hours every Thursday afternoon, providing the perfect window for my covert mission. My heart pounded as I waited an additional 15 minutes to ensure she wouldn't return for forgotten items, then drove slowly toward the cabin while scanning the area for any neighbors who might witness my arrival. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially breaking into my own property, but Madison's illegal occupation had forced me into this desperate situation. I parked behind the cabin, near the old boat shed, where my car wouldn't be visible from the main road, then walked around to the basement storm cellar entrance that Madison probably didn't even know existed. Grandmother Evelyn had installed this secondary entrance during the 1980s as an emergency exit, and the heavy wooden doors were concealed beneath overgrown bushes and fallen leaves. The rusty hinges protested loudly as I pulled the doors open, revealing concrete steps leading down into the musty darkness of the basement. I'd brought a powerful flashlight and my grandmother's detailed map, but my hands still shook as I descended into the space that held both my financial salvation and evidence of Madison's crimes. The basement looked largely unchanged from my childhood memories, with its stone foundation walls and exposed wooden beams, creating shadowy alcoves, perfect for hiding valuable items. However, I immediately noticed several cardboard boxes stacked near the furnace that definitely didn't belong to my grandmother's carefully organized storage system. Moving closer to investigate, I discovered the boxes contained financial documents, legal papers, and what appeared to be Madison's personal correspondence dating back several months. My flashlight beam revealed bank statements showing her divorce settlement amount attorney consultation notes, and most shocking of all, a detailed timeline documenting her plan to steal the cabin. One folder contained copies of emails between Madison and someone named Trevor, apparently her real estate developer cousin, who'd been advising her on the property's commercial potential. The emails revealed that Madison had been planning this theft for over a year, long before Grandmother Evelyn's death, and had been gathering information about adverse possession laws and property development opportunities. The old lady can't live forever. Read one email from 6 months before my grandmother's death. I've been researching the legal requirements for challenging inheritance decisions, and I think we can make a strong case that Darby abandoned her family responsibilities. The cabin's worth at least $150,000 as a teardown, and the lot could support 3 modern vacation homes worth $200,000 each. The casual cruelty of referring to our beloved grandmother as the old lady while calculating profit from her death made me physically nauseous. Madison's scheme wasn't just theft. It was a calculated betrayal of everything our family had represented for generations. Another email from Trevor provided detailed advice about establishing adverse possession claims. You need to document exclusive occupancy and make permanent improvements to strengthen your case. Change the locks, immediately file the paperwork within 30 days, and make sure you have witnesses who can testify that Darby abandoned the property voluntarily. This evidence was overwhelming and damning, providing clear proof of Madison's premeditated conspiracy to steal my inheritance through fraud and manipulation. I quickly photographed every document with my phone, ensuring I'd have copies, even if Madison discovered and destroyed the originals. Following my grandmother's map, I located the loose pantry board she'd described and carefully removed it to reveal a wrapped package containing antique jewelry that sparkled even in my flashlight beam. The pieces were clearly valuable family heirlooms that Madison would have sold or destroyed without understanding their historical significance. The hollowed space beneath the basement stairs contained 3 first edition books wrapped in waterproof plastic, including a signed copy of a famous nature writer's work that my grandmother had treasured. These items represented not just monetary value, but irreplaceable connections to family history and literary heritage. Finally, I found the false wall panel behind the furnace that concealed my grandmother's safe. The combination she'd provided worked perfectly, revealing neat stacks of cash totaling exactly $25,000, along with additional family documents and photographs I'd never seen before. As I carefully transferred the money and valuables to my backpack, I heard a car door slam outside the cabin. My blood turned to ice as I realized Madison had returned much earlier than expected, probably because one of her children had forgotten something important or gotten sick during swimming lessons. I quickly closed the safe and replaced the false panel, then crept to the small basement window to assess my situation. Madison's minivan was parked directly in front of the main entrance, and I could hear her voice and the sounds of children running around upstairs. Trapped in the basement with evidence of my unauthorized entry, I had no choice but to wait and hope Madison wouldn't have any reason to come downstairs. The storm cellar exit was on the opposite side of the basement, requiring me to cross directly beneath the main living area where she and the children were now located. Trevor, I'm at the cabin and something feels wrong. I heard Madison say, apparently talking on her cell phone. The basement door is open when I always keep it locked, and there are footprints in the dust down there that weren't there this morning. My heart rate accelerated as I realized Madison was far more observant and paranoid about security than I'd anticipated. She'd been monitoring the property like a fortress, probably expecting exactly the kind of intrusion I was currently attempting. I'm going to check the basement thoroughly, she continued. If that pathetic sister of mine thinks she can sneak around my property looking for evidence or trying to steal things, she's about to learn a very expensive lesson about trespassing and breaking and entering. The malice in her voice was chilling, revealing the true depth of her hatred and contempt for me personally, rather than just her desire for the cabin property. This wasn't just about money or real estate. It was about power control and her need to completely destroy my connection to our family legacy. I heard her footsteps moving toward the basement stairs and knew I had only seconds to find a hiding place or escape route. The storm cellar exit was too far away to reach without being seen, and the basement's open layout provided few concealment options. However, as Madison's voice grew closer, I overheard her continuing conversation with Trevor and realized this might be an unexpected opportunity to gather even more incriminating evidence about their conspiracy. The development timeline is still on track, she was saying. I've got the adverse possession paperwork filed, and the family is completely convinced that Darby abandoned her responsibilities voluntarily. Once I get through the 7-year waiting period, we can tear down this old dump and build the 3 vacation homes we discussed. She paused near the basement stairs, apparently listening to Trevor's response. Don't worry about Darby fighting back. She's a broke schoolteacher who can't afford decent legal representation. I've already consulted with all the competent attorneys in the area to create conflicts of interest, so she'll be stuck with some inexperienced lawyer from Minneapolis who doesn't understand local property law. The casual admission of her strategic manipulation of the legal system provided additional evidence of conspiracy and potentially criminal interference with my right to counsel. Madison's overconfidence was leading her to document her own crimes through careless phone conversations. The best part is that I've been intercepting her mail sent to the cabin address, Madison continued with obvious satisfaction. Property tax notices, legal correspondence. Anything that might have helped her case just disappears before she can respond. By the time she figures out what's happening, it'll be too late to matter. The admission of mail theft was a federal crime that could result in serious criminal charges beyond the civil property dispute. Madison had just provided me with evidence of multiple felonies committed in furtherance of her scheme to steal my inheritance. As her footsteps began descending the basement stairs, I pressed myself against the stone foundation wall behind a stack of old furniture, hoping the shadows would provide enough concealment until she finished her inspection and returned upstairs. "I'll call you back, Trevor," she said, apparently ending her phone conversation. "I need to make sure nobody's been snooping around down here. Then we can finalize the construction timeline for next spring." The flashlight beam from her cell phone swept across the basement as she methodically checked each corner and storage area. I held my breath and remained completely motionless, knowing that discovery would result not just in confrontation, but potentially criminal charges for breaking and entering my own inherited property. The basement grew silent, except for Madison's measured footsteps as she conducted her security inspection, her phone's flashlight casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. I pressed myself deeper into the alcove behind Grandmother Evelyn's old steamer trunks, trying to control my breathing, while she moved methodically through each section of the underground space. "I know someone was down here," Madison muttered to herself, her voice carrying a paranoid edge that suggested she'd been expecting this kind of intrusion. "The dust patterns are completely wrong, and that basement door doesn't open by itself." Her flashlight beam swept dangerously close to my hiding place as she examined the area near the furnace where I'd accessed the hidden safe. For a terrifying moment, I thought she might have discovered the false panel or noticed signs of my tampering, but she moved on without apparent suspicion. Above us, I could hear her children running through the cabin rooms, their voices echoing through the floorboards as they played some kind of energetic game. The contrast between their innocent laughter and their mother's criminal scheming was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Madison's phone rang, startling both of us in the basement's confined space. She answered immediately, apparently recognizing the caller's identity. "Trevor, perfect timing," she said, her voice returning to its earlier confident tone. "I've finished checking the basement and everything looks secure. We can proceed with the next phase of our timeline without worrying about interference from my pathetic sister." She settled onto an old wooden crate near the basement stairs, apparently preparing for an extended conversation about their development plans. My cramped hiding position was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, but this unexpected opportunity to overhear their detailed conspiracy was invaluable. "The architectural plans you sent look fantastic," Madison continued enthusiastically. "Tearing down this old eyesore and building 3 modern vacation homes will triple the property's value. I especially love the design for the lakefront unit with the private dock and entertainment deck." Trevor's voice was audible through her phone speaker, though I couldn't make out specific words. Madison's responses, however, revealed the scope and timeline of their scheme with devastating clarity. 7 years feels like a long time to wait," she admitted, "but the adverse possession timeline is non-negotiable under Minnesota law. The good news is that I've been documenting every single day of exclusive occupancy, and I've got multiple witnesses who'll testify that Darby abandoned the property voluntarily." She laughed coldly at something Trevor said, then continued with obvious satisfaction. "My parents have been incredibly helpful in establishing the abandonment narrative. They're completely convinced that Darby doesn't deserve the cabin anyway, and they're prepared to testify about her lack of family commitment and responsibility." The betrayal cut deep, but I forced myself to focus on gathering evidence rather than processing the emotional impact of my family's complete moral collapse. Madison's admissions were providing exactly the kind of documented proof I'd need to expose her crimes in court. "The mail interception strategy has been particularly effective," she continued, property tax notices, legal correspondence. Anything that might have alerted her to deadlines or procedures just disappears into my collection. She has no idea how much important information she's missed because she assumes everything gets forwarded to her Minneapolis address. Trevor apparently asked about the financial aspects of maintaining the deception, because Madison's next comments focused on costs and timeline management. The divorce settlement gives me more than enough resources to outlast any legal challenge she might attempt, Madison said confidently. Even if she somehow raises money for an attorney, I can drag out the litigation for years while the adverse possession clock keeps running. Time is completely on my side in this situation. She paused for a moment, apparently listening to Trevor's input, then continued with even more disturbing revelations about their partnership. Don't worry about local opposition to the development project. I've been cultivating relationships with the Planning Commission members, and I've already identified which neighbors might need financial incentives to support our variance applications. A few strategic donations to local charities and political campaigns should smooth the approval process considerably. The corruption implicit in her comments suggested that Madison and Trevor had been planning this theft for far longer than I'd initially realized. They weren't just stealing family property. They were orchestrating a comprehensive fraud involving local government officials and community institutions. The environmental impact assessment shouldn't be a problem either, Madison continued. Trevor, your contacts at the county office have been very helpful in explaining how to minimize complications from wetland regulations and shoreline protection requirements. As long as we file the right paperwork and make the right contributions, the approval process should be straightforward. I felt sick listening to the casual discussion of bribing local officials and circumventing environmental protections that had been established to preserve the lake's natural beauty. Grandmother Evelyn would have been horrified to know that her beloved cabin was being stolen to enable exactly the kind of commercial development she'd spent decades opposing. What about Darby's potential legal response? Trevor's voice became more audible as Madison adjusted her phone position. Are you confident she can't afford to challenge this effectively? Madison's laughter was harsh and contemptuous. She's a public school teacher making less than $40,000 a year with student loan debt and barely enough savings to cover emergency car repairs. Even if she maxes out credit cards and borrows money from friends, she can't possibly match my financial resources for prolonged litigation. The accuracy of her assessment of my financial limitations was both impressive and disturbing, suggesting she'd been monitoring my economic situation far more closely than I'd realized. Madison had calculated every aspect of this theft, including my inability to mount effective legal resistance. Besides, she continued, I've already neutralized most of her potential legal options by consulting with the best attorneys in the area. Conflict of interest rules will force her to hire someone from Minneapolis or St. Paul who doesn't understand local property law and won't have established relationships with judges and court personnel. Her strategic thinking was sophisticated and ruthless, revealing a level of planning that went far beyond simple family greed. Madison had essentially declared war on my inheritance and had been preparing for battle while I remained completely unaware of the threat. The beauty of adverse possession law is that it rewards persistence over legitimacy, she explained to Trevor. As long as I can maintain exclusive control of the property for 7 years, the legal system will eventually recognize my claim, regardless of the original inheritance. Darby's rights become increasingly meaningless with each passing month. Above us, the children's voices grew more distant as they apparently moved outside to play in the yard. Madison seemed to interpret this as increased privacy for her conversation, because her tone became even more conspiratorial. I've been thinking about accelerating the timeline by documenting deliberate abandonment rather than just passive neglect, she said. If I can create evidence that Darby explicitly rejected her inheritance responsibilities, the adverse possession period might be reduced or eliminated entirely. Trevor's response was inaudible, but Madison's next words revealed the most chilling aspect of their conspiracy. Forging a few documents wouldn't be that difficult, especially since I have access to samples of her handwriting from old birthday cards and family letters. A notarized statement declaring her intention to abandon the property would essentially end any legal challenge before it could begin. The casual discussion of document forgery as a tactical option demonstrated that Madison was prepared to commit serious felonies to complete her theft of my inheritance. She'd already admitted to mail fraud and conspiracy. Now she was contemplating additional criminal acts to ensure her success. I realized I'd gathered more than enough evidence to expose Madison's crimes and destroy her adverse possession claim. The recorded admissions of mail theft, bribery conspiracy, and planned forgery would provide prosecutors with an overwhelming case for criminal charges while simultaneously undermining any civil claim she might pursue. However, I was still trapped in the basement while Madison conducted her phone conversation directly above my escape route. I needed to wait for her to finish and return upstairs before attempting to reach the storm cellar exit and escape with my evidence. "Trevor, I should probably get back upstairs and check on the kids," Madison said finally. "Let's schedule another call next week to review the construction timeline and finalize our strategy for the Planning Commission presentations." As her footsteps moved toward the basement stairs, I prepared to wait several more minutes before attempting my escape, knowing that premature movement could still result in discovery and confrontation. The evidence I'd gathered was far too valuable to risk losing through careless timing or overconfidence. 20 minutes after Madison's footsteps disappeared up the basement stairs, I finally emerged from my hiding place and crept toward the storm cellar exit with my backpack full of evidence and my grandmother's hidden inheritance. My hands trembled as I carefully opened the heavy wooden doors, scanning the area to ensure Madison and her children weren't outside, where they might witness my escape. The afternoon sun felt blinding after the basement's darkness, and I had to pause for several seconds to let my eyes adjust before making the dangerous dash to my car parked behind the boat shed. Every sound seemed amplified as I hurried across the open ground, expecting Madison's voice to shout accusations of trespassing and theft at any moment. Once safely in my car, I drove several miles down the winding lakeside road before pulling over at a scenic overlook to call the attorney Michael Rodriguez, whose office I'd researched during my preparation for this mission. Unlike the local Duluth lawyers Madison had compromised through strategic consultations, Michael practiced in Hennepin County and specialized in complex inheritance disputes involving family fraud. "Mr. Rodriguez," I said when his secretary connected me, "my name is Darby Walsh, and I need immediate legal representation for a property theft case involving adverse possession fraud, mail crimes, and family conspiracy. I have substantial evidence and the financial resources to pursue this aggressively." His interest was immediately apparent when I mentioned having both evidence and funding, two elements that were often missing in family property disputes. We scheduled an emergency consultation for the following morning, giving me time to organize the overwhelming amount of documentation I'd gathered. Back in my Minneapolis apartment that evening, I spread the contents of my backpack across my dining room table like pieces of a complex puzzle. Grandmother Evelyn's $25,000 in cash sat next to photographed emails revealing Madison's conspiracy with Trevor, while my phone contained audio recordings of her basement conversation discussing mail fraud and planned document forgery. The antique jewelry and first edition books represented tangible proof that I'd been the intended recipient of valuable family heirlooms that Madison would have sold or destroyed without understanding their significance. More importantly, these items demonstrated my grandmother's trust in my stewardship of family legacy and heritage. I spent hours organizing the evidence into coherent categories: financial documents proving Madison's resources and planning correspondence, revealing the conspiracy timeline audio recordings of criminal admissions and photographs of stolen mail and forged documents. The case against Madison was becoming stronger with each piece of evidence I reviewed. Michael Rodriguez's law office occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown Minneapolis skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Mississippi River and the city's skyline. The environment conveyed competence and success in a way that Sarah Jenkins' traditional Duluth office couldn't match. Michael himself was a man in his early 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested he approached legal problems like chess matches, requiring strategic thinking several moves ahead. His initial assessment of my situation was both encouraging and sobering. "Miss Walsh, you've gathered more solid evidence than I typically see in inheritance fraud cases," he said after reviewing my documentation for over an hour. "The audio recordings of your sister discussing mail theft and planned document forgery are particularly valuable because they establish both criminal intent and ongoing conspiracy." He leaned back in his leather chair, consulting notes he'd made during our discussion. "However, we need to move quickly on several fronts. First, we'll file for an immediate temporary restraining order to prevent your sister from making any further alterations to the property or disposing of additional family assets." The speed and decisiveness of his approach was exactly what I'd hoped for after my frustrating consultation with Sarah Jenkins. Michael clearly understood that aggressive legal action was necessary to counter Madison's systematic theft and manipulation. "Second," he continued, "we'll file criminal complaints with both federal and state authorities regarding the mail fraud and conspiracy charges. The United States Postal Inspection Service takes mail theft very seriously, especially when it's committed in furtherance of other crimes like property fraud." I felt a surge of satisfaction imagining Madison's shock when federal agents appeared at the cabin to investigate her crimes. She'd been so confident in her immunity from legal consequences that criminal charges would shatter her sense of control and superiority. Third, we'll pursue civil remedies including damages for the property, alterations, lost rental income, and emotional distress caused by her systematic deception. The combination of criminal charges and civil liability should provide substantial leverage for negotiating a complete resolution. Michael's multifaceted approach addressed every aspect of Madison's crimes while maximizing my chances of recovering both the property and compensation for the damages she'd caused. More importantly, his strategy would expose her behavior to public scrutiny and potential criminal prosecution. "What about the adverse possession claim itself?" I asked. "Can we get that dismissed immediately, or do we have to wait for the criminal case to be resolved?" "The evidence you've gathered essentially destroys any legitimate adverse possession claim," Michael explained. "Adverse possession requires good faith occupancy, but your sister's own admissions prove she knew the property belonged to you legally and that she was stealing it through deliberate fraud. No court will recognize a claim based on documented criminal activity." The legal framework was becoming clearer, and I finally felt like I had a competent advocate who understood both the technical aspects of property law and the strategic elements of fighting sophisticated criminals. Madison's overconfidence had led her to create a detailed record of her own crimes, providing exactly the evidence needed to destroy her scheme. "How quickly can we begin filing these motions and complaints?" I asked, eager to shift from defensive to offensive legal strategy. "I can have the emergency injunction filed this afternoon," Michael replied. "The criminal complaints will take slightly longer because they require coordination with federal and state prosecutors, but I expect to have everything submitted within 48 hours. As I prepared to leave his office, Michael offered one final piece of strategic advice that demonstrated his understanding of family dynamics and inheritance disputes. "Miss Walsh, be prepared for your sister to escalate her tactics Once she realizes she's facing serious legal consequences, he warned, desperate people often make poor decisions that create additional evidence against themselves. Document everything she does from this point forward, because her response to these legal filings may provide even more ammunition for our case. The prediction proved accurate sooner than either of us anticipated. That evening, as I was reviewing my bank statements to organize financing for the legal fees, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. "Darby, this is Madison," the voice said, but the tone was completely different from her previous confident communications. "I think we need to have a serious conversation about resolving this situation before it gets out of hand for both of us." The shift from condescending superiority to nervous conciliation suggested that Madison had somehow learned about my visit to Michael Rodriguez's office, or sensed that her legal position was deteriorating rapidly. "I'm listening," I said, neutrally activating my phone's recording function to capture whatever desperate proposals she might offer. "I've been thinking about your situation, and I realize I may have been too hasty in assuming you wanted to give up the cabin," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and conciliatory. "Maybe we can work out some kind of shared arrangement that benefits both our families." The transparent attempt at manipulation was almost insulting in its obvious desperation. Madison had spent months stealing my property and spreading lies about my character, but now wanted to negotiate as if we were equals in a legitimate dispute. "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" I asked, curious to see how far she would retreat from her previous demands. "Well, I've put a lot of time and money into improving the property over the past few months," she said, apparently trying to establish a foundation for compensation claims. "If you want to resume occupancy, it would only be fair for you to reimburse me for the renovations and maintenance expenses I've covered." The audacity of demanding payment for improvements made to stolen property demonstrated that Madison still didn't understand the legal reality of her situation. She was essentially asking me to pay her for the privilege of reclaiming my own inheritance. Madison, I think you should know that I'm now represented by counsel and that we'll be filing several legal actions against you within the next few days," I said calmly. "Any further discussions about the property should go through our attorneys." The silence that followed was so complete that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Madison finally spoke again, her voice carried a mixture of shock and barely controlled anger. "You're making a huge mistake, Darby. Fighting me in court will cost you everything you have and destroy our family relationships permanently. Is your pride really worth more than family harmony and financial security?" The threat was both revealing and pathetic, exposing Madison's assumption that I would prioritize family peace over justice and legal rights. She'd calculated that I would accept theft and manipulation rather than risk confrontation and conflict. "Goodbye, Madison," I said before ending the call, knowing that our next communication would be through legal proceedings rather than personal negotiations. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a sense of anticipation and nervous energy that reminded me of the moments before important exams or job interviews. Tomorrow would begin the formal legal battle for my inheritance, but I finally had the resources, evidence, and professional representation necessary to fight Madison's crimes effectively. The hidden money and wisdom from Grandmother Evelyn's letter had provided me with both practical tools and emotional foundation for this confrontation. More importantly, I discovered that standing up for what's right sometimes requires accepting temporary isolation and conflict in order to preserve long-term integrity and justice. The next morning brought a flurry of legal activity as Michael Rodriguez's office began implementing our multi-pronged strategy against Madison's theft and fraud. While his paralegal prepared the emergency injunction paperwork, I drove back to the cabin neighborhood to begin documenting the property damage Madison had caused during her illegal occupancy. I'd arranged to meet with Patricia Morrison, a certified historical preservationist who specialized in evaluating damage to heritage properties and calculating restoration costs for insurance and legal purposes. Patricia's expertise would be crucial in demonstrating how Madison's improvements had actually destroyed irreplaceable historical features of the cabin. Patricia was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested decades of experience dealing with property owners who didn't understand the value of historical preservation. She arrived at the cabin carrying a professional camera, measuring devices, and a clipboard thick with official forms. "Based on the photographs you sent, I'm expecting to find significant damage to the original architectural features," Patricia said as we walked around the cabin's exterior. "Many people don't realize that 1920s construction techniques and materials have specific historical significance that can't be replicated with modern substitutes." Even from outside, the evidence of Madison's destructive renovations was immediately apparent. The original cedar shingles had been painted over with modern exterior paint that obscured the natural wood grain and texture. Window trim that had been hand-carved by local craftsmen during the cabin's original construction had been replaced with mass-produced plastic molding. "This is architectural vandalism," Patricia said grimly as she photographed each alteration. "Your grandmother's property was an excellent example of Northwood's cabin architecture from the 1920s. These modifications have destroyed much of its historical integrity and significantly reduced its potential for landmark designation." Inside the cabin, the damage was even more extensive and heartbreaking. Madison had painted over the original knotty pine walls with bright white paint that completely changed the cabin's warm, rustic character. The stone fireplace had been surrounded with modern tile that clashed horribly with the natural stone and destroyed the focal point of the main living area. "The kitchen renovations are particularly problematic," Patricia explained as she documented Madison's changes. "The original built-in cabinetry was crafted by local artisans using techniques that are no longer practiced. Replacing these custom features with mass-produced modern cabinets eliminates irreplaceable historical craftsmanship." She estimated that restoring the cabin to its original condition would cost at least $30,000, assuming replacement materials could be found and craftsmen skilled in historical restoration techniques could be located. Some of the damage might be irreversible, permanently reducing the property's historical significance and potential landmark status. "I'll prepare a comprehensive report documenting each alteration and providing cost estimates for proper restoration," Patricia said as she concluded her inspection. "This will be valuable evidence for both your civil lawsuit and any potential criminal charges related to destruction of historical property." While Patricia completed her documentation, I drove to downtown Grand Rapids to meet with several longtime family friends who could provide character witness testimony about my relationship with grandmother Evelyn and Madison's true attitude toward the cabin inheritance. My first stop was the home of Nancy Campbell, who had been my grandmother's closest friend and bridge partner for over 20 years. Nancy had attended my grandmother's funeral and had witnessed Madison's behavior during the reception and family gatherings that followed. "Your grandmother spoke about you constantly," Nancy said as we sat in her cozy living room, surrounded by photographs of family gatherings spanning several decades. "She was so proud of your teaching career and your commitment to environmental education. She always said you were the only grandchild who truly understood her love of nature and simple living." Nancy's memories provided crucial testimony about grandmother Evelyn's genuine intentions regarding the cabin inheritance and her specific concerns about Madison's materialistic values and lack of appreciation for family heritage. "I remember Madison making some very inappropriate comments at the funeral reception," Nancy continued. "She was discussing the cabin's commercial potential with several relatives talking about vacation rental income and development opportunities. It was shocking to hear someone discussing profit at their grandmother's funeral. Her testimony would be invaluable in court, especially since Madison had been portraying herself as the grieving granddaughter who simply wanted to preserve family traditions while I pursued selfish career interests in the city. My next visit was to Robert Chen, who had been my high school principal and had maintained a friendship with our family for over 15 years. Robert had attended my college graduation and had written recommendation letters for my teaching positions, giving him first-hand knowledge of my character and values. "I've always been impressed by your maturity and sense of responsibility," Robert said as we discussed my situation. "Even as a teenager, you showed exceptional respect for your elders and genuine appreciation for family traditions. The idea that you would abandon your inheritance responsibilities is completely inconsistent with everything I know about your character." He also remembered Madison's behavior at social gatherings and family events, particularly her tendency to focus on material possessions and social status, rather than meaningful relationships and personal growth. Madison always seemed more interested in what people owned than who they were as individuals, Robert observed. I remember her asking detailed questions about property values and investment portfolios at parties where other people were discussing books, travel experiences, or community volunteer work. These character witness testimonies were building a comprehensive picture of the real family dynamics that contradicted Madison's carefully constructed narrative about my alleged abandonment of family responsibilities and her supposed commitment to preserving our grandmother's legacy. My final stop was the Grand Rapids Public Library, where I met with Linda Peterson, the head librarian who had worked closely with my grandmother on several local history preservation projects. Linda had extensive documentation of Grandmother Evelyn's community involvement and her specific concerns about protecting natural areas from commercial development. Your grandmother was one of our most dedicated volunteers," Linda said as she showed me files of correspondence and project documents. "She spent hundreds of hours researching local history and organizing archives of family photographs and documents donated by longtime residents. More importantly, Linda had copies of letters my grandmother had written to the County Planning Commission opposing various development proposals that would have harmed the lake's environmental integrity and historical character. She was particularly concerned about subdivision projects that would destroy the area's rural character," Linda explained. She believed strongly that some places should be preserved in their natural state for future generations, rather than being developed for maximum commercial profit. This evidence would be crucial in demonstrating that Madison's development plans with Trevor directly contradicted everything Grandmother Evelyn had valued and fought to protect during her lifetime. As I drove back toward Minneapolis that afternoon, my phone rang with a call from Michael Rodriguez's office. His paralegal informed me that the emergency injunction had been filed and that Madison would be served with court papers within 24 hours, ordering her to cease all modifications to the property and preserve all existing family belongings and documents. "Mr. Rodriguez also wanted me to tell you that the federal postal inspector has agreed to interview you next week regarding the mail theft allegations," she added. "They're very interested in the recorded admissions you provided and want to discuss opening a criminal investigation." The legal machinery was finally moving in my favor, with multiple agencies and legal proceedings converging to expose Madison's crimes and protect my inheritance rights. Her confidence in her immunity from consequences was about to be shattered by the reality of federal criminal investigation and civil litigation. That evening, I received a furious phone call from my mother, apparently after Madison had contacted our parents about the legal proceedings I'd initiated against her. "Darby, what in the world are you thinking?" Helen demanded. "Madison called us crying about lawyers and court papers and criminal investigations. This is absolutely insane behavior that's going to destroy our family permanently." The conversation revealed how thoroughly Madison had manipulated our parents' understanding of the situation, portraying herself as the innocent victim of my vindictive legal attack, rather than the calculating criminal who had stolen my inheritance through systematic fraud. Mom Madison has committed multiple felonies in order to steal property that legally belongs to me, I said firmly. She's admitted to mail theft conspiracy and planning to forge documents. These aren't family disagreements. These are serious crimes that require legal prosecution. Helen's response demonstrated the effectiveness of Madison's emotional manipulation and her ability to position herself as a sympathetic single mother being attacked by her successful childless sister. You're destroying 3 innocent children's security and happiness because you're jealous of Madison's family and bitter about being single, my mother accused. Your grandmother would be heartbroken to see you using lawyers and courts to attack your own sister over a piece of property. The reversal of moral responsibility was both infuriating and predictable, representing exactly the kind of family dynamics that had enabled Madison's criminal behavior in the first place. Our parents had chosen to believe comfortable lies rather than confront uncomfortable truths about their daughter's character. Grandmother Evelyn left me a letter explaining exactly why she chose me as the cabin's guardian and warning me about Madison's manipulative behavior, I said. She predicted this entire situation and provided me with the resources to fight for what's legally and morally right. The mention of my grandmother's letter seemed to shake Helen's certainty for the first time since this crisis began. What kind of letter? Madison never mentioned anything about additional communications from your grandmother. Was a letter explaining her concerns about Madison's materialistic attitude and her specific instructions for protecting the cabin from exactly the kind of commercial development Madison is planning with her cousin Trevor. I replied, Grandmother Evelyn knew this battle was coming and she armed me with both evidence and resources to win it. The conversation ended with my mother demanding to see the letter and my refusal to share evidence that would inevitably be reported back to Madison before our court proceedings began. The family relationships that I'd hoped to preserve were already damaged beyond repair by Madison's crimes and my parents' willingness to participate in her conspiracy. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a mixture of sadness about my family's moral collapse and determination to honor my grandmother's trust in my integrity and strength. The legal battle was just beginning, but I had everything necessary to expose Madison's crimes and reclaim my inheritance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and potentially more desperate tactics from Madison as she realized that her carefully constructed fraud was unraveling under professional legal scrutiny and criminal investigation. The next morning brought chaos as Madison apparently received her court papers and realized the full scope of the legal assault I'd mounted against her criminal enterprise. My phone began ringing at 6:30 with calls from blocked numbers, family members, and even strangers who had somehow been drawn into Madison's increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. I ignored most of the calls while preparing for my meeting with Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the United States Postal Inspection Service, who had agreed to interview me regarding Madison's mail theft crimes at the federal building in downtown Minneapolis. Agent Walsh was a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and the kind of direct professional demeanor that suggested extensive experience investigating mail fraud cases. Her small office was decorated with commendations and photographs from various law enforcement ceremonies, creating an atmosphere of competence and authority. Miss Walsh, mail theft in furtherance of property fraud is a federal crime that we take very seriously, she said as she reviewed the evidence I'd provided. The recorded admissions you've obtained are particularly valuable because they demonstrate both criminal intent and ongoing conspiracy. She explained that the Postal Inspection Service had been tracking increasing numbers of inheritance fraud cases involving family members who intercepted legal correspondence to prevent rightful heirs from responding to important deadlines and procedures. Your sister's systematic interception of property tax notices and legal correspondence represents a sophisticated scheme to deprive you of your due process rights. Agent Walsh continued. This goes beyond simple mail theft into the realm of civil rights violations and conspiracy to commit fraud. The federal perspective on Madison's crimes was both validating and encouraging, demonstrating that her behavior constituted serious criminal conduct, rather than just a family property dispute that could be resolved through civil litigation. What kind of timeline are we looking at for criminal charges? I asked, hoping that federal prosecution might provide additional leverage for resolving the property theft. We'll need to coordinate with state authorities since your sister's crimes involve both federal mail theft and state property fraud, Agent Walsh explained. However, I expect to have criminal complaints filed within 2 weeks, assuming our investigation confirms the evidence you've provided. As I left the federal building, I felt a sense of momentum and official validation that contrasted sharply with the isolation and helplessness I'd experienced when first discovering Madison's theft. Professional law enforcement agencies were taking her crimes seriously and moving quickly to hold her accountable. However, Madison's response to the legal pressure was escalating in exactly the way Michael Rodriguez had predicted. When I arrived back at my apartment, I discovered that someone had attempted to break into my building and had left threatening messages with my apartment manager. A woman claiming to be your sister was here around noon demanding access to your apartment, the building manager informed me. She said you'd stolen family property and that she had a legal right to search for stolen items. She became quite aggressive when I refused to let her inside without proper authorization. The attempted break-in demonstrated that Madison's desperation was leading her to commit additional crimes that would only strengthen the case against her. Her systematic approach to theft and fraud was degenerating into reckless criminal behavior that created more evidence of her guilt. My phone rang as I was documenting the attempted break-in for my attorney. The caller ID showed my father's number, and I answered, hoping for some sign that at least one parent might be willing to acknowledge the truth about Madison's behavior. "Darby, you need to drop these legal proceedings immediately," Robert said without any preliminary greeting. "Madison is beside herself with worry about losing her children and going to prison over what should be a simple family property discussion." The reversal of cause and effect was typical of my family's approach to Madison's criminal behavior, focusing on her emotional distress rather than the crimes that had caused legitimate legal consequences. Indeed, Dad Madison chose to commit mail theft, property fraud, and conspiracy when she decided to steal my inheritance, I replied firmly. The legal consequences are the direct result of her criminal choices, not my response to those crimes. She's offering to give you the cabin back if you'll agree not to pursue criminal charges, Robert said, apparently trying to negotiate a resolution that would protect Madison from the consequences of her actions. Isn't getting your property back more important than sending your sister to prison? The offer revealed that Madison finally understood the seriousness of her legal situation, but her proposal to return stolen property in exchange for immunity from prosecution was both legally impossible and morally unacceptable. "The criminal charges aren't mine to drop," I explained. "Federal mail theft and state conspiracy charges are prosecuted by government attorneys who represent the public interest, not private victims. Madison committed crimes against the legal system itself, not just against me personally." Moreover, her offer to return the cabin didn't address the thousands of dollars in damages she'd caused through her destructive renovations, or the emotional trauma she'd inflicted through months of systematic deception and family manipulation. Besides, I continued, how can anyone trust Madison's word about anything after she's spent months lying to everyone about this entire situation? What guarantee do I have that she won't simply change her mind again once the legal pressure is reduced? Robert's silence suggested that he couldn't provide any assurance about Madison's future behavior, probably because he was finally beginning to recognize the extent of her deception and manipulation of the entire family. Your mother and I are thinking about hiring our own attorney to represent Madison, he said finally. We can't stand by and watch our daughter face prison time over a family property disagreement. The threat was both predictable and pathetic, representing our parents' last attempt to rescue Madison from the consequences of her criminal choices through additional financial support and legal assistance. That's your decision to make, I said, but you should know that any attorney who reviews the evidence against Madison will advise her to negotiate a plea bargain, rather than risk a lengthy prison sentence at trial. The evidence of her crimes is overwhelming and undeniable. As evening approached, I received an unexpected call from Dorothy Peterson, the neighbor who had originally believed Madison's lies about my abandonment of the cabin, but had promised to monitor the situation more carefully. "Darby, dear, I think you should know what happened at the cabin this afternoon," Dorothy said, her voice carrying a mixture of concern and outrage. Madison returned from somewhere in a complete rage and began screaming at her children about packing their belongings immediately. According to Dorothy's account, Madison had been ranting about legal persecution and family betrayal while throwing items into boxes and loading them into her minivan with obvious panic and desperation. She was yelling into her phone about needing to get away before the police arrived, Dorothy continued. The children were crying and asking what they'd done wrong, and Madison kept telling them that their Aunt Darby was trying to send their mother to prison. The attempt to flee suggested that Madison understood the strength of the evidence against her and was considering abandoning her adverse possession claim rather than facing criminal prosecution. However, fleeing while under federal investigation would only add additional charges to her already serious legal problems. "Did you see which direction she went when she left?" I asked, wondering if Madison might be planning to disappear entirely rather than face the consequences of her crimes. "'Cause she drove toward town, but she was driving erratically and much too fast for safety," Dorothy replied. "Frank and I are both concerned about those children's welfare if Madison continues making such poor decisions under pressure." The endangerment of her children represented a new dimension of Madison's criminal behavior that might trigger additional interventions from family services and law enforcement agencies. Her desperation was leading to increasingly reckless decisions that would only worsen her legal situation. I immediately called Michael Rodriguez to report Madison's apparent attempt to flee and request emergency court orders to prevent her from leaving the state with evidence or assets that might be needed for restitution and criminal proceedings. "We'll file for an emergency order first thing tomorrow morning," Michael assured me. "If your sister is planning to flee rather than face prosecution, she's making the worst possible decision for both her legal situation and her children's welfare." That night, I received one final phone call from Madison herself, apparently calling from her car while driving somewhere unknown. Her voice was barely controlled, mixing hysteria with desperate manipulation. "Darby, you've destroyed everything," she sobbed into the phone. "My children are terrified. My ex-husband is threatening to take them away permanently, and I'm facing federal criminal charges over a stupid piece of property that isn't even worth the legal fees you're spending." The attempt to minimize the cabin's value while simultaneously claiming it was too valuable to give up revealed the contradictions in Madison's position, but her emotional collapse was both genuine and predictable. "Yeah, Madison, you chose to commit serious crimes to steal my inheritance," I said calmly. "Every consequence you're facing is the direct result of your own criminal decisions. You can still minimize the damage by cooperating with the authorities and making full restitution." "Oh, I hate you," she screamed before ending the call, leaving me staring at my phone and feeling a mixture of sadness and relief that the pretense of family harmony was finally over. The battle for my inheritance was far from finished, but Madison's desperate flight and emotional collapse suggested that her carefully constructed fraud was crumbling under the pressure of professional legal investigation and criminal prosecution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as law enforcement agencies coordinated their response to her apparent attempt to flee, but I felt confident that justice would ultimately prevail over Madison's elaborate criminal conspiracy. The following morning brought swift action from both state and federal law enforcement agencies as they coordinated their response to Madison's apparent flight from prosecution. I arrived at Michael Rodriguez's office to find him already on the phone with prosecutors discussing emergency measures to prevent Madison from destroying evidence or fleeing the state entirely. The county sheriff's department has issued a BOLO alert for your sister's vehicle. Michael informed me after concluding his call. They're treating this as a potential flight risk situation involving federal crimes and child endangerment concerns. Within hours, Madison's desperate gambit backfired spectacularly when she was pulled over for erratic driving on Highway 2 near Bemidji, apparently heading toward the Canadian border with her 3 confused and frightened children. The traffic stop revealed that she'd been driving under the influence of prescription medication while carrying a large amount of cash and important family documents. Agent Walsh called me that afternoon to provide an update on Madison's arrest and the charges being filed against her. Your sister is facing federal mail theft charges, state conspiracy, and fraud charges, and now additional counts related to child endangerment and attempted flight from prosecution, she explained. The evidence from her vehicle search included additional stolen mail and documents that strengthen our case considerably. More importantly, Madison's arrest had triggered an immediate review of her children's living situation by County Family Services, who determined that her increasingly erratic behavior posed a potential threat to their safety and welfare. Her ex-husband had filed an emergency motion for full custody, citing her criminal charges, and demonstrated poor judgment. The custody situation is actually helping our case, Michael explained during an afternoon strategy session. Your sister's attorney is advising her to negotiate a plea bargain rather than risk a lengthy prison sentence that would permanently separate her from her children. Madison's overconfidence and systematic criminal planning had collapsed into desperate improvisation that only worsened her legal situation with each poor decision. Her attempt to flee had transformed her from a sophisticated property thief into an obvious criminal flight risk who posed a danger to her own children. The construction crew that Madison had hired to begin illegal demolition work arrived at the cabin that same morning, unaware that their employer was sitting in jail and that the property was under court protection. County building inspectors were waiting for them with stop work orders and citations for attempting unpermitted construction in an environmentally sensitive area. Your sister never obtained proper permits for any of the construction work she'd planned, Patricia Morrison informed me when she called with an update on the environmental violations. The county is treating this as deliberate circumvention of wetland protection regulations, which carries significant fines and potential criminal penalties. Trevor's development company immediately distanced itself from the project once Madison's arrest became public knowledge, claiming they'd been misled about her legal ownership of the property and her authority to authorize construction work. Their abandonment left Madison without financial backing or professional support for her development scheme. Trevor's company is now cooperating with prosecutors to avoid being charged as co-conspirators in the fraud, Agent Walsh explained during her follow-up call. They're providing documentation of their communications with your sister that further establishes the premeditated nature of her crimes. The domino effect of Madison's arrest was systematically dismantling every aspect of her elaborate theft scheme, while exposing additional crimes and civil violations that multiplied her legal exposure exponentially. Her divorce attorney contacted Michael's office that afternoon, expressing serious concerns about how Madison's criminal charges would affect her existing custody arrangement and financial settlement from her previous marriage. Her ex-husband is arguing that the criminal behavior demonstrates a pattern of deception and poor judgment that makes her unfit for joint custody, the attorney explained. If she's convicted of these felony charges, she could lose access to her children permanently. The threat to her relationship with her children represented the most powerful leverage prosecutors could use in negotiating a plea bargain that would include full restitution and formal abandonment of any claims to my inheritance. Meanwhile, my parents were finally beginning to understand the true scope of Madison's deception as they attempted to hire legal representation for her defense. Every attorney they consulted provided the same assessment: the evidence against Madison was overwhelming, and her best option was to negotiate the most favorable plea bargain possible. "The lawyers all say the same thing," my mother Helen admitted during a difficult phone conversation that evening. "Madison lied to everyone about everything, and now she's facing serious prison time because of her own choices." Helen's acknowledgement of Madison's deception represented the first crack in the family's unified support for her criminal behavior, but it came far too late to influence the legal proceedings or repair the damage to our relationships. "I keep thinking about what your grandmother's letter said about Madison's character," Helen continued quietly. "Maybe Evelyn understood things about our family that we didn't want to see or acknowledge." The environmental impact assessment that county officials conducted revealed that Madison's illegal tree removal had caused significant erosion damage to the shoreline area that would require professional remediation, costing over $50,000. The environmental violations added another major financial penalty to Madison's growing legal debt. "Your sister's attempts to accelerate the development timeline actually violated multiple state and federal environmental protection laws," Patricia Morrison explained. "The remediation costs will be added to the restitution calculations, and she'll face additional fines for the illegal alterations to protected wetland areas." Madison's systematic approach to theft had expanded into a comprehensive attack on environmental protections that had been established to preserve the lake's natural ecosystem, adding conservation groups and environmental agencies to the list of entities demanding accountability for her crimes. Local media attention began focusing on the case as news outlets picked up the story of family inheritance fraud involving environmental destruction and child endangerment. The negative publicity further damaged Madison's reputation and made her position increasingly untenable in the small lakeside community. "Lakeside property theft scheme exposes environmental crimes," read the headline in the regional newspaper, accompanied by photographs of the damaged shoreline and quotes from environmental advocates condemning Madison's destructive behavior. The story portrayed Madison as a greedy criminal who had attempted to destroy a historic family property for commercial profit while endangering her own children through increasingly reckless behavior under legal pressure. The case represents everything wrong with prioritizing short-term financial gain over environmental stewardship and family heritage, commented a spokesperson for the Regional Conservation Alliance who had worked with my grandmother on previous preservation projects. Madison's public humiliation was complete, as community members who had initially believed her lies about my abandonment of family responsibilities now understood that she'd been manipulating everyone through systematic deception and criminal behavior. Her attempt to portray herself as a victim of legal persecution collapsed entirely when details of her recorded admissions and planned document forgery became public through court filings and media coverage. "Local woman admits to mail theft and conspiracy in recorded phone calls" became the follow-up headline that exposed Madison's own words describing her criminal planning and contempt for both legal processes and environmental protections. The comprehensive failure of Madison's criminal enterprise was becoming apparent to everyone who had been drawn into her web of lies and manipulation, from family members to neighbors to professional associates who had unknowingly assisted her illegal activities. Trevor's development company faced its own investigation for potential involvement in the environmental violations and unpermitted construction work, creating additional pressure for them to provide complete cooperation with prosecutors investigating the broader conspiracy. We're looking at potential criminal charges against anyone who knowingly participated in the scheme to circumvent environmental regulations and zoning requirements. The county prosecutor explained during a press conference about the expanding investigation. Madison's overreach had transformed a family property theft into a multi-agency criminal investigation involving federal mail fraud, state conspiracy charges, environmental crimes, and child endangerment allegations that could result in decades of prison time if prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Following Madison's arrest and the collapse of her support network, the legal proceedings moved rapidly toward resolution, as prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions coordinated their cases and Madison's overwhelmed defense attorney scrambled to negotiate the best possible plea bargain for his client. The federal mail theft charges carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison, while the state conspiracy and fraud charges could add another 10 years to any criminal penalty. The environmental violations and child endangerment allegations represented additional exposure that could extend Madison's potential incarceration well beyond what any reasonable person would risk at trial. Your sister's attorney has requested a meeting to discuss potential plea negotiations. Michael Rodriguez informed me during our weekly strategy session. He's essentially admitting that fighting these charges at trial would be legal suicide given the overwhelming evidence against her. Madison's recorded admissions of mail theft conspiracy and planned document forgery provided prosecutors with ironclad evidence of her criminal intent and behavior, while the physical evidence of stolen correspondence and forged documents eliminated any possibility of claiming the charges were based on misunderstandings or family disputes. The federal prosecutor is demanding full restitution for all damages, formal abandonment of any property claims, and substantial community service focused on environmental restoration projects. Agent Walsh explained during her update call, they want to send a message that inheritance fraud and environmental crimes have serious consequences. Madison's children were now living full-time with their father, who had been granted emergency custody based on evidence of her criminal behavior and increasingly erratic decision-making under pressure. The custody loss represented the personal consequence that Madison feared most, providing additional motivation for her to accept whatever plea agreement prosecutors offered. Her ex-husband's attorney has made it clear that any plea bargain must include provisions preventing her from relocating the children or interfering with their stability during her legal proceedings. Michael explained, the children's welfare is now a major factor in structuring any resolution to these criminal charges. The environmental remediation costs had grown to over $60,000 as county engineers completed their assessment of the shoreline damage Madison's illegal tree removal had caused. The financial penalties were accumulating faster than Madison could possibly pay, even with the substantial divorce settlement she'd received. Your sister's financial situation is becoming increasingly desperate as the restitution calculations continue growing, Michael observed. She's facing total financial ruin in addition to potential imprisonment, which gives prosecutors enormous leverage in plea negotiations. Trevor's development company had provided prosecutors with detailed documentation of Madison's lies about property ownership and her authorization for unpermitted construction work, further establishing the premeditated nature of her fraud and her willingness to involve innocent third parties in her criminal schemes. The construction company is cooperating fully to avoid being charged as co-conspirators, Agent Walsh reported. Their communications with your sister provide additional evidence of her systematic deception and criminal planning spanning over 18 months. Madison's attempts to manipulate local government officials through strategic donations and personal relationships had also attracted the attention of county ethics investigators who were reviewing whether her actions constituted attempted bribery or corruption of public officials. The ethics investigation is proceeding independently of the criminal charges, but it could result in additional civil penalties and permanent restrictions on her involvement in local development projects. The county prosecutor explained during a media briefing about the expanding scandal. Local environmental groups had organized protests demanding maximum penalties for Madison's destruction of protected wetland areas, arguing that lenient treatment of environmental crimes encouraged similar violations by other developers and property owners. Cases like this demonstrate why we need strong enforcement of environmental protection laws, declared the spokesperson for the Northwoods Conservation Alliance at a rally outside the county courthouse. Allowing family property disputes to excuse environmental destruction sets a dangerous precedent that threatens our natural heritage. The community pressure for accountability was mounting as residents learned more details about Madison's systematic deception and her contempt for both legal processes and environmental stewardship that many local families had supported for generations. My parents finally requested a meeting with me to discuss their role in Madison's crimes and their desire to make amends for their participation in her conspiracy against my inheritance rights. We realize now that Madison manipulated us just as much as she manipulated everyone else, my father Robert admitted during our emotionally difficult conversation. We should have trusted your grandmother's judgment and refused to participate in what we now understand was a criminal conspiracy. Helen was particularly distraught about how their support for Madison's lies had enabled her crimes and endangered her children's welfare through her increasingly desperate and reckless behavior under legal pressure. We thought we were helping a struggling single mother maintain family stability, she explained through tears. Instead, we were supporting criminal behavior that ultimately destroyed Madison's relationship with her children and ruined her entire future. Their willingness to acknowledge their mistakes and testify truthfully about Madison's deception and manipulation represented a crucial development that would strengthen the prosecution's case while potentially beginning the long process of rebuilding some family relationships. Your grandmother was right about Madison's character, and she was right about your strength and integrity, Robert said quietly. We're ashamed that we allowed ourselves to be manipulated into betraying our own daughter's legal rights and moral principles. The family reconciliation was tentative and conditional, dependent on their willingness to support truth and accountability, rather than continuing to enable Madison's destructive behavior through misplaced loyalty and emotional manipulation. Madison's public defender had requested psychiatric evaluation to determine whether her increasingly erratic behavior represented mental health issues that might mitigate her criminal responsibility. But the systematic nature of her planning and deception argued against any defense based on diminished capacity. Your sister's crimes demonstrate sophisticated planning and deliberate deception spanning over 18 months, the prosecutor explained. Mental health issues don't excuse systematic criminal behavior, especially when it involves endangering children and destroying environmental resources. The psychiatric evaluation revealed that Madison was suffering from depression and anxiety related to her legal situation, but found no evidence of mental illness that would excuse or mitigate her criminal behavior, or diminish her understanding of the consequences of her actions. The defendant was fully aware that her actions constituted criminal behavior, the court-appointed psychiatrist reported. Her recorded admissions demonstrate clear understanding of legal and moral boundaries that she chose to violate for personal financial gain. As Madison's plea negotiations continued, her defense attorney made increasingly desperate attempts to minimize her criminal exposure by claiming that family property disputes shouldn't be subject to federal prosecution or environmental enforcement actions. This is essentially a civil matter that has been inappropriately escalated to criminal prosecution. Her lawyer argued during a preliminary hearing, my client was attempting to resolve a family inheritance dispute through legitimate legal processes. However, Madison's own recorded words describing mail theft, planned document forgery, and deliberate circumvention of environmental regulations demolished any claim that her behavior represented legitimate legal action rather than systematic criminal conspiracy. The defendant's own admissions establish criminal intent beyond any reasonable doubt, the federal prosecutor responded. She explicitly described committing federal crimes and conspiring with others to defraud her sister and circumvent environmental protection laws. The judge's preliminary ruling indicated that Madison's plea negotiations should focus on accepting responsibility for her crimes and maximizing restitution rather than attempting to minimize her culpability through claims of family dispute or mental health mitigation. The evidence of systematic criminal planning is overwhelming, the judge observed. The defendant's best option is to negotiate a plea agreement that acknowledges her responsibility and focuses on making full restitution to her victims and the community. Madison's final attempt to avoid accountability was crumbling as quickly as her original criminal scheme, leaving her with no option except accepting whatever plea agreement prosecutors were willing to offer in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. The turning point in Madison's case came when local environmental groups organized a community meeting at the Grand Rapids Community Center to discuss the broader implications of her environmental crimes and the precedent that her case might set for future enforcement of conservation regulations. Over 100 residents attended the meeting, including many who had known our family for decades and had worked with grandmother Evelyn on various preservation projects. The community response was overwhelmingly supportive of strong enforcement and maximum penalties for Madison's destruction of protected natural areas. Evelyn Walsh spent 40 years fighting to protect this lake from exactly the kind of commercial development her granddaughter attempted, declared Margaret Thompson, a longtime conservation advocate who had served on multiple environmental committees with my grandmother. Allowing family relationships to excuse environmental destruction dishonors everything Evelyn worked to preserve. The speakers included county commissioners, environmental scientists, and representatives from regional conservation organizations who described how Madison's violations threatened the broader ecosystem and could encourage similar illegal development if not prosecuted vigorously. Wetland destruction and shoreline erosion affect water quality for the entire lake system, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a hydrologist from the University of Minnesota Duluth. Individual property owners don't have the right to damage shared natural resources for personal profit, regardless of family circumstances or financial motivations. The scientific testimony demonstrated that Madison's crimes had consequences extending far beyond our family property dispute, affecting community resources and environmental integrity that belong to current and future generations of residents. Local media coverage of the community meeting further damaged Madison's public reputation and eliminated any remaining sympathy for her position as a struggling single mother who had been mistreated by legal persecution. Community demands justice for environmental destruction, read the headline in the regional newspaper, accompanied by photographs of the damaged shoreline and quotes from residents condemning Madison's contempt for environmental stewardship and community values. The article included detailed descriptions of grandmother Evelyn's conservation work and her specific efforts to protect the cabin property from commercial development, creating a stark contrast between her environmental legacy and Madison's destructive criminal behavior. "The irony is devastating," commented Frank Peterson in his interview with the newspaper. Evelyn Walsh dedicated her life to protecting this area from development, and her own granddaughter tried to destroy it for exactly the kind of commercial project Evelyn spent decades fighting against. The community pressure for accountability was reinforced by a petition signed by over 300 local residents demanding maximum prosecution of Madison's environmental crimes and substantial penalties to deter similar violations in the future. environmental protection laws only work if they're enforced consistently and vigorously, the petition stated. Allowing family circumstances to excuse environmental destruction undermines the legal framework that protects our shared natural heritage. The petition was presented to county prosecutors and environmental regulators during a public ceremony that received extensive media coverage, further isolating Madison from any potential community support for lenient treatment. Madison's defense attorney made one final desperate attempt to generate sympathy for his client by arranging a television interview where she claimed to be the victim of a vindictive legal system that was destroying her family over minor property disagreements. "Oh, I'm a single mother facing prison time because my sister couldn't accept a reasonable family compromise about property inheritance," Madison said during the interview, apparently hoping to portray herself as a victim of prosecutorial overreach and family vindictiveness. However, the television reporter had thoroughly researched the case and was prepared with specific questions about Madison's recorded admissions of criminal behavior and her systematic deception of family members and community residents. "Mrs. Madison Walsh, we have recordings of you discussing mail theft and planned document forgery with your cousin Trevor," the reporter stated directly. "How do you reconcile those admissions with your claims of innocence and victimization?" Madison's response revealed the extent of her self-deception and inability to accept responsibility for her criminal choices, even when confronted with her own words describing deliberate, illegal activities. "Those conversations were taken out of context," she claimed weakly. "I was just exploring legal options for resolving a family property dispute that had gotten unnecessarily complicated through misunderstandings and poor communication." The interview continued with increasingly specific questions about the environmental violations, the mail theft, and the child endangerment charges that had resulted from her attempt to flee prosecution with her children. "How do you explain driving under the influence with your 3 children while carrying stolen mail and documents?" the reporter asked. "That seems to go well beyond exploring legal options for property disputes." Madison's inability to provide coherent explanations for her behavior only reinforced public perception of her as a criminal who was attempting to escape accountability through manipulation and false victimization claims. The broadcast generated extensive social media commentary, virtually all of which condemned Madison's behavior and supported strong prosecution of her environmental crimes and systematic deception of family members and community residents. This woman destroyed protected wetlands and stole federal mail while claiming to be a victim, read one typical online comment. She should face maximum penalties for her environmental crimes and her systematic lies to everyone who tried to help her. The overwhelming negative public response eliminated any possibility that Madison's defense strategy of claiming victimization would generate sympathy or support for reduced charges or lenient sentencing. Environmental advocacy organizations use Madison's case as an example in their broader campaigns for stronger enforcement of conservation regulations and stiffer penalties for violations of environmental protection laws. The Madison Walsh case demonstrates why we need federal prosecution of environmental crimes, argued the spokesperson for the National Environmental Defense Alliance during a press conference in Minneapolis. State and local authorities often lack the resources or political will to prosecute environmental destruction vigorously, especially when family relationships or local politics complicate enforcement. The case was becoming a symbol of broader issues regarding environmental protection, property rights, and the enforcement of conservation regulations that protected shared natural resources from individual exploitation and destruction. Madison's recorded admission that she never cared about the cabin's sentimental value and only wanted it for the money was played repeatedly in media coverage, providing devastating evidence of her true motivations and complete lack of respect for family heritage or environmental stewardship. That statement reveals everything we need to know about the defendant's character and motivations, commented the federal prosecutor during a press briefing. She explicitly admitted that her only concern was financial profit, not family legacy or environmental protection. The audio recording destroyed any remaining possibility that Madison could claim her actions were motivated by genuine family concerns or emotional attachment to our grandmother's property and legacy. Her children's therapist reported to family court that they were struggling to understand why their mother had lied to everyone and had endangered their safety through her criminal behavior and flight from prosecution. The children are asking why mommy told lies and why she was driving scary when the police stopped us, the therapist explained during a custody hearing. They're confused about the difference between what their mother told them and what actually happened. The impact on Madison's children represented the most tragic consequence of her criminal choices, destroying their sense of security and trust, while potentially damaging their relationship with their mother permanently. Her ex-husband's attorney argued that Madison's systematic deception and criminal behavior demonstrated a pattern of poor judgment that made her unsuitable for unsupervised contact with the children until she completed extensive rehabilitation and counseling programs. The defendant's willingness to endanger her children's safety while fleeing from prosecution of her environmental crimes shows a fundamental lack of parental responsibility and judgment, the attorney stated during family court proceedings. Madison's legal situation was deteriorating rapidly as community pressure, media attention, and family court proceedings converged to eliminate any possibility of avoiding serious legal consequences for her comprehensive criminal conspiracy. Faced with mounting criminal charges, overwhelming evidence, and complete isolation from community and family support, Madison made one final desperate attempt to salvage her situation by contacting Channel 12 News with claims that she was being persecuted by a vindictive legal system and a jealous sister who couldn't accept reasonable family compromises. The television station's investigative reporter Jennifer Martinez had been following the case for weeks and was well prepared with documented evidence of Madison's crimes when she agreed to conduct the on-camera interview that Madison hoped would generate public sympathy for her position. "Mrs. Walsh, thank you for agreeing to speak with us," Jennifer began professionally. "Our viewers are interested in hearing your side of this family property dispute that has resulted in federal criminal charges and environmental violations." Madison had clearly rehearsed her talking points, focusing on themes of family reconciliation and prosecutorial overreach while avoiding any mention of her recorded criminal admissions or systematic deception of family members and community residents. "This whole situation has been blown completely out of proportion," Madison said, looking directly into the camera with practiced sincerity. "I'm a single mother who was trying to provide stability for my children using family property that my grandmother would have wanted us to enjoy together." Jennifer allowed Madison to present her narrative for several minutes before beginning the aggressive questioning that would expose the contradictions and lies underlying her victim portrayal. "Mrs. Walsh, we have audio recordings of you discussing federal mail theft and planned document forgery with your cousin, Trevor." Jennifer said, her tone remaining professional but firm. "Specifically, we have recordings of you saying, and I quote, 'I've been intercepting her mail sent to the cabin address, including important legal documents and tax notices that could have helped her case.'" Madison's confident demeanor faltered immediately as she realized that her own words would be used to contradict her claims of innocence and victimization. "Those conversations were private family discussions that have been taken completely out of context," Madison replied weakly. "I was simply exploring all legal options for resolving a complicated inheritance situation that had created unnecessary family conflict." Jennifer continued with even more damaging evidence, including Madison's recorded admission about her true motivations for stealing the cabin property. "We also have recordings of you stating, and again, I'm quoting directly, 'I never cared about the cabin's sentimental value and only wanted it for the money,'" Jennifer said. How do you reconcile that statement with your claims about providing family stability and honoring your grandmother's memory? The contradiction was so obvious that Madison could only stammer ineffectively about family emotions being complicated and her words being misunderstood by people who didn't know the full context of the situation. Mrs. Walsh, can you explain why you were driving under the influence with your 3 children while carrying stolen federal mail when you were arrested near the Canadian border? Jennifer asked, moving to perhaps the most damaging aspect of Madison's behavior. Madison's attempt to minimize the seriousness of her flight with the children while under investigation for federal crimes only reinforced the impression that she was incapable of accepting responsibility for her choices or understanding the consequences of her actions. I was upset about the legal persecution my family was facing, and I may have made some poor decisions while under emotional stress. Madison said, apparently believing that emotional distress could excuse child endangerment and attempted flight from prosecution. The interview continued with Jennifer presenting additional evidence of Madison's environmental crimes, including photographs of the destroyed shoreline and expert testimony about the costs of remediation and restoration. Environmental scientists have determined that your illegal tree removal has caused over $60,000 in erosion damage to protected wetland areas, Jennifer stated. The county prosecutor has described this as one of the most serious environmental violations in recent years. What's your response to those allegations? Madison's claim that she was unaware of environmental regulations and had been following advice from construction professionals was immediately contradicted by recordings of her discussing deliberate circumvention of permit requirements with Trevor. Mrs. Walsh, we have recordings of you discussing ways to avoid environmental permits and inspections, Jennifer pointed out. In one conversation, you specifically mention avoiding county officials who might interfere with your development timeline. How do you explain that contradiction? By the end of the 20-minute interview, Madison had effectively destroyed any remaining possibility of public sympathy while providing additional evidence of her deception and lack of genuine remorse for her criminal behavior. The broadcast generated immediate and overwhelmingly negative response from viewers who called and emailed the television station to express outrage about Madison's apparent belief that she was entitled to steal property and destroy environmental resources without facing serious consequences. "This woman is exactly what's wrong with our society," wrote one typical viewer response. "She commits serious crimes against her own family and our shared environment, then claims to be the victim when she faces legal accountability. She should get the maximum sentence possible." Social media commentary was similarly harsh, with multiple posts describing Madison as a cautionary example of entitlement and criminal behavior that threatened both family relationships and environmental protection. "Watching this interview made me sick," posted one local resident. "She has no remorse for stealing her sister's inheritance or destroying protected wetlands. She's only sorry she got caught and is facing consequences." The negative publicity eliminated any remaining possibility that Madison's defense strategy could generate sympathy or support for reduced charges or lenient sentencing recommendations. Environmental groups used clips from the interview in their advocacy campaigns, highlighting Madison's admission that she never cared about environmental stewardship or family heritage, only financial profit from commercial development. This interview perfectly captures the mindset that threatens our natural resources, commented a spokesperson for the Sierra Club during their press conference responding to the broadcast. Some people view protected environmental areas as nothing more than financial opportunities to be exploited regardless of legal requirements or community values. Madison's children's therapist reported that the television interview had created additional trauma for them as they struggled to understand why their mother was saying things on television that contradicted what she had told them about the family situation. "The children are confused about why mommy's story on TV is different from what she told them," The therapist explained to family court. They're asking if mommy was lying to them or lying to the TV people, and they don't understand why grown-ups would lie about important things. The impact on the children provided additional evidence for family court proceedings that would likely result in permanent restrictions on Madison's custody rights and her relationship with her children. Her ex-husband's attorney used clips from the interview to demonstrate that Madison continued to show poor judgment and lack of genuine remorse that made her unsuitable for unsupervised contact with the children. The defendant's television appearance demonstrates continued narcissistic behavior and inability to accept responsibility for actions that endangered our client's safety and emotional well-being, the attorney argued during subsequent custody hearings. Madison's public humiliation was complete, having destroyed her own credibility and eliminated any remaining support for her position, while providing prosecutors and family court with additional evidence of her criminal behavior and unfitness as a parent. The interview represented the final collapse of Madison's elaborate deception and manipulation campaign, leaving her completely isolated and facing maximum penalties for her environmental crimes and systematic theft of family property. 2 weeks after Madison's disastrous television interview, her defense attorney finally acknowledged the hopelessness of her situation and formally requested plea negotiations with both federal and state prosecutors. The evidence against her was so overwhelming that even the most inexperienced attorney could see that fighting the charges at trial would result in maximum sentences on all counts. "Your sister's lawyer has essentially surrendered," Michael Rodriguez informed me during our final strategy session before the plea hearing. He's requesting the most lenient plea bargain possible in exchange for full cooperation and admission of guilt on all charges. The federal prosecutor had agreed to recommend a suspended sentence with extensive probation community service focused on environmental restoration and complete restitution for all damages in exchange for Madison's formal admission of guilt and permanent abandonment of any claims to my inheritance. She'll plead guilty to federal mail theft, state conspiracy, and fraud charges and multiple environmental violations, Agent Walsh explained during her final briefing. The plea agreement requires her to pay full restitution, perform 500 hours of community service with environmental restoration projects, and remain on federal probation for 3 years. More importantly, for my situation, the plea agreement included Madison's formal renunciation of any property claims and her acknowledgement that she had stolen my inheritance through systematic criminal deception and fraud. The court record will permanently establish that your sister's adverse possession filing was based on criminal activity and deliberate fraud, Michael explained. This eliminates any possibility of future legal challenges to your ownership while creating a clear legal precedent protecting inheritance rights from family theft schemes. Madison's financial situation was completely destroyed by the restitution requirements, which totaled over $90,000, including property restoration costs, environmental remediation, legal fees, and damages for emotional distress and lost rental income. She'll be making restitution payments for the next 10 years, the prosecutor explained. Her divorce settlement and any future earnings will be garnished until the full amount is paid, ensuring that she faces long-term financial consequences for her criminal choices. The community service requirement was specifically designed to force Madison to work on exactly the kind of environmental restoration projects that grandmother Evelyn had supported throughout her life, creating poetic justice for her attempt to destroy protected natural areas for commercial profit. 500 hours of wetland restoration and invasive species removal should give the defendant time to reflect on the environmental consequences of her illegal actions, the judge commented during the plea hearing. Community service will be supervised by the County Conservation Department with detailed reporting requirements. Madison's parents attended the plea hearing, finally understanding the full scope of their daughter's criminal behavior and the permanent damage she had caused to family relationships through her systematic deception and theft. We're ashamed that we allowed ourselves to be manipulated into supporting criminal behavior. My father Robert told me after the hearing, "Your grandmother was right about Madison's character, and we should have trusted her judgment instead of enabling this disaster." Helen was particularly emotional about the impact on Madison's children, who would grow up knowing that their mother was a convicted criminal who had stolen from family members and destroyed environmental resources for personal gain. "Those poor children will live with this shame for the rest of their lives," she said tearfully. "Madison's crimes haven't just destroyed her own future, they've damaged her children's sense of security and trust in their family relationships." The family reconciliation process would be long and difficult, requiring us to rebuild trust and communication that had been shattered by Madison's manipulation and our parents' willingness to participate in her conspiracy against my inheritance rights. "We want to help restore the cabin, to honor your grandmother's memory, and make amends for our role in this disaster," Robert offered. "It's the least we can do to begin repairing the damage that Madison's crimes have caused to our family relationships." Madison's children were now living permanently with their father, who had been granted full custody based on evidence of her criminal behavior, and the psychological evaluation suggesting that her narcissistic personality traits made her unsuitable for responsible parenting without extensive therapy and supervision. The court finds that the defendant's criminal behavior and systematic deception demonstrate a pattern of poor judgment that compromises her ability to provide stable, honest guidance for minor children. The family court judge ruled during the custody proceedings. The children would be allowed supervised visitation with Madison once she completed anger management and parenting classes, but their primary residence and decision-making authority belonged entirely to their father and his new wife. They're getting counseling to help them process their mother's criminal behavior and understand that they weren't responsible for her choices, their father explained when he contacted me to express his gratitude for exposing Madison's crimes. "They need to understand that love doesn't require accepting dishonesty or criminal behavior from family members." The therapeutic process would help the children develop healthy boundaries and critical thinking skills that would protect them from potential future manipulation attempts, while preserving whatever positive aspects of their relationship with Madison might be salvageable. Trevor's development company faced its own civil and criminal penalties for their role in Madison's environmental violations, including substantial fines and permanent restrictions on their ability to work on projects involving environmentally sensitive areas. The company has agreed to pay additional restitution for their role in planning illegal development and circumventing environmental regulations, the county prosecutor announced. They'll also face ongoing monitoring of their future projects to ensure compliance with all environmental protection requirements. The legal precedent established by Madison's case strengthened enforcement mechanisms for environmental protection and inheritance rights, providing prosecutors with clear authority to pursue criminal charges against similar schemes in the future. This case demonstrates that family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior or environmental destruction. The state attorney general commented during a press conference about the broader implications of the prosecution. Property inheritance disputes must be resolved through legitimate legal processes, not criminal conspiracy and environmental violation. 6 months after Madison's sentencing, I stood in the fully restored cabin kitchen, watching the sunrise through windows that had been returned to their original wood frames and clear glass. The insurance settlements and restitution payments had funded a complete historical restoration that honored Grandmother Evelyn's memory while adding modern safety and efficiency features. The Historical Society had expedited the landmark designation process, ensuring permanent protection for the cabin and surrounding property from future development threats or commercial exploitation. Your grandmother would be so proud, Dorothy Peterson said, as she and Frank brought me fresh vegetables from their garden to stock the restored kitchen. The cabin looks exactly like it did when Evelyn first brought you here as a little girl, and it's protected forever from the kind of destruction Madison attempted. The restoration had become a community project, with local craftsmen donating their skills to repair the environmental damage and restore the cabin's original character using traditional materials and techniques that honored its historical significance. This project represents everything your grandmother valued about community cooperation and environmental stewardship, Frank observed as we walked around the property, noting how the damaged shoreline had been restored with native plants and erosion control measures. Madison's crimes actually brought the community together in defense of the values that Evelyn spent her lifetime promoting. 1 year after Madison's sentencing, I sat on the cabin's restored front porch, watching the sunrise paint the lake surface in shades of gold and amber, just as grandmother Evelyn and I had done countless times during my childhood summers. The grandfather clock chimed softly from the mantel where it belonged, surrounded by the antique quilts and family photographs that Madison had tried to replace with her modern decorations. The past year had brought profound changes to our family relationships and community connections that extended far beyond the legal resolution of Madison's crimes. The cabin had become a symbol of environmental stewardship and historical preservation that attracted visitors from across the region who wanted to learn about grandmother Evelyn's conservation work and the successful prosecution of environmental crimes. The Evelyn Walsh Heritage Cabin now served as an educational center where school groups learned about wetland ecology and sustainable property management, fulfilling my grandmother's dream of sharing her love of nature with future generations. The small scholarship fund I'd established had grown through community donations into a substantial program supporting local students pursuing careers in environmental science and conservation. Madison was completing her community service with the County Conservation Department, spending weekends removing invasive species and restoring damaged wetland areas under close supervision. The work was physically demanding and emotionally humbling, forcing her to confront the environmental consequences of her criminal behavior, while contributing to the restoration of resources she had tried to destroy. Your sister seems to be learning something from the experience, Dorothy Peterson observed during one of our weekly coffee conversations. She's actually asking questions about proper restoration techniques and showing genuine interest in understanding the ecological damage she caused. The transformation was gradual and tentative, but Madison's mandatory environmental education was apparently beginning to penetrate her previous indifference to conservation issues and community values. Her supervised therapy sessions were helping her understand the destructive patterns of entitlement and manipulation that had led to her criminal behavior. The children are doing much better now that they have stability and honest communication about what happened. Their father informed me during our occasional check-in calls. They understand that their mother made serious mistakes, but that they're not responsible for her choices or her consequences. The children had visited the restored cabin twice with their father's supervision, learning about their great-grandmother's conservation work and the importance of environmental stewardship for protecting natural resources that belong to entire communities, rather than individual property owners. They're proud of their great-grandmother's legacy and excited about the educational programs that honor her memory, their stepmother added. It helps them understand that they come from a family with positive values and contributions, even though their mother made destructive choices. My parents had become active volunteers with the Heritage Cabin's educational programs, channeling their guilt about supporting Madison's crimes into positive work that honored grandmother Evelyn's memory and community values. We can't undo the damage we caused by believing Madison's lies, Helen said as she organized historical photographs for a new museum display. But we can spend the rest of our lives supporting the values that your grandmother represented and trying to repair the relationships that Madison's crimes damaged. Robert had taken responsibility for maintaining the cabin's grounds and historical features, learning traditional carpentry and preservation techniques that connected him to the craftsmanship and attention to detail that had made the property special for multiple generations. Working on this restoration has taught me things about our family heritage that I never understood before, he admitted during one of our weekend work sessions. Your grandmother wasn't just preserving a building, she was maintaining a connection to values and traditions that Madison almost destroyed completely. The legal precedent established by Madison's prosecution had strengthened enforcement of environmental protection laws throughout northern Minnesota, with prosecutors citing our case as an example of the serious consequences awaiting anyone who attempted to circumvent conservation regulations for personal profit. The Madison Walsh case has become a powerful deterrent against environmental crimes and inheritance fraud, Michael Rodriguez explained during our final legal consultation. Other attorneys are using it as an example when advising clients about the risks of attempting similar schemes. The comprehensive documentation of Madison's crimes had also been incorporated into law enforcement training programs, helping federal and state investigators recognize the warning signs of systematic property theft and environmental fraud before they could cause irreversible damage. Environmental advocacy organizations had used our story in their broader campaigns for stronger protection of wetland areas and historical properties, demonstrating how individual crimes could threaten shared community resources and cultural heritage. The successful prosecution of environmental crimes sends a clear message that conservation laws have teeth, the Sierra Club spokesperson explained during a regional conference on environmental enforcement. Communities can protect their natural heritage when they're willing to hold criminals accountable regardless of family relationships or social connections. The restored cabin had been featured in multiple magazines and documentaries about historical preservation and environmental protection, spreading Grandmother Evelyn's conservation message to audiences far beyond our local community. This story represents hope for communities facing similar threats to their natural and historical resources, commented the narrator of a National Geographic documentary about wetland preservation. It proves that determined individuals can successfully defend environmental heritage against criminal exploitation and commercial destruction. As I prepared to lock the cabin and return to my teaching responsibilities in Minneapolis, I reflected on the profound lessons that this battle had taught me about family loyalty, environmental stewardship, and the courage required to defend what's right against overwhelming pressure and manipulation. Grandmother Evelyn's final letter had provided not just financial resources and legal evidence, but wisdom about the difference between love and enabling, between family harmony and moral compromise. Her prediction that standing up for what's right sometimes requires standing alone temporarily had proven accurate, but the temporary isolation had ultimately led to stronger relationships based on honesty and shared values, rather than manipulation and deception. The cabin would continue serving as an educational center and community gathering place that honored both environmental conservation and the importance of fighting for justice, even when the opponents are family members who use emotional manipulation and financial pressure to avoid accountability for their criminal choices. Madison's crimes had inadvertently strengthened the very conservation values she had tried to destroy, creating a permanent legacy of environmental protection and historical preservation that would benefit future generations of visitors and community members. The greatest victory wasn't the legal vindication of my inheritance rights or the financial compensation for damages Madison had caused, but the preservation of Grandmother Evelyn's values and the demonstration that criminal behavior has consequences regardless of family relationships or emotional manipulation. As I walked to my car, carrying the antique jewelry and first edition books that represented tangible connections to family heritage, I felt grateful for the strength and wisdom that had enabled me to honor my grandmother's trust and protect her legacy from those who valued money more than meaning. The sunrise over the lake promised another beautiful day for the school group that would be visiting the heritage cabin to learn about wetland ecology and the importance of environmental stewardship for protecting natural resources that belong to all of us, rather than any individual property owner. Have you ever faced a situation where family members tried to manipulate you into accepting unfair treatment or criminal behavior? How did you find the strength to stand up for what was right, even when it meant challenging people you loved? I'd love to hear your stories and thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like to help others find it. Subscribe to our channel for more true family stories and share it with anyone who might benefit from understanding that love sometimes requires setting firm boundaries and refusing to enable destructive behavior. Thank you for listening, and remember that protecting what's right is always worth the temporary discomfort of standing alone against those who choose manipulation over honesty. May you always have the courage to defend your principles and the wisdom to recognize when family loyalty becomes complicity in harmful behavior.